In the winter of 1941, America slept with a clear conscience. The oceans, it was believed, were wide enough to keep the world's chaos at bay. Europe burned under the shadow of Hitler, Asia trembled before Japan's imperial advance, but across the Atlantic and Pacific, the United States stood apart, confident in its isolation, strong in its industrial heart. To most Americans, war was something that happened to other people, in other lands. Theirs was a land of motion pictures, automobiles, jazz, and dreams, not trenches and gunfire. In Washington, the debates raged, to intervene or stay apart. Congressmen quoted George Washington's warnings against foreign entanglements. Newspapers spoke of neutrality, of peace. But beneath those words, tension simmered. Japan's armies had marched through China unchecked for years. Its ships now patrolled the Pacific like wolves searching for prey. The U.S. had condemned its aggression with words and sanctions, cutting off steel, cutting off oil, but it had not yet drawn its sword. Out in Hawaii, Pearl Harbor gleamed beneath the morning sun, its waters still and proud. Battleships lined the harbor like monuments to American strength. The Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, California, Nevada, giants of steel resting under blue skies. Sailors trained, drilled, and laughed. Their days began with reveille and ended with the scent of salt and motor oil. To them, war was distant noise, rumors from Manila or whispers from Europe. But beyond the horizon, something unseen was gathering. Japan, cut off from resources and cornered by embargoes, faced a choice between retreat or war. And retreat was never in its nature. Inside the imperial palace in Tokyo, men spoke in quiet tones of destiny and empire. In dimly lit rooms, maps of the Pacific were spread across tables, dotted with circles around places like Manila, Singapore, and Pearl Harbor. American diplomats in Japan still clung to hope. Notes were exchanged, meetings extended late into the night. The Japanese ambassador bowed politely, promised peace, and spoke of friendship. Behind those gestures, the fleet had already sailed, 6 carriers, 400 aircraft, in the silence of a mission from which none expected to return unscathed. In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt felt the weight of uncertainty. The Navy urged caution but feared weakness. Intelligence officers whispered of intercepted communications, fragments that hinted at danger, but not where or when. The world was changing, and America, though mighty, was not yet awake to its peril. On the streets of Los Angeles, people went about their business, theaters playing Citizen Kane, factories booming with life, soldiers kissing their wives before routine drills. Across the Pacific, on the island of Oahu, sailors filled their Saturday nights with laughter and letters home. They spoke of Christmas coming soon, of the beautiful Hawaiian sunsets, of how lucky they were to be far from the front. And yet, the signs were there for those who could see them. Japanese consulates in Hawaii sent coded reports to Tokyo detailing the positions of ships in the harbor. Reconnaissance aircraft flew unseen across Pacific skies. In the naval offices, reports trickled in suspicious radio silence, fleet movements that didn't add up, but they were buried beneath 1,000 other dispatches. At Pearl Harbor's airfields, planes rested wingtip to wingtip, lined neatly against sabotage, the very order that would make them easy prey. On Ford Island, the band practiced for Sunday services. Chaplains prepared their sermons about peace, about faith, about the season of giving. That night, the sea was calm. The stars over Hawaii were brilliant, scattered like silver on black velvet. It was the last night of America's innocence. In Tokyo, the order went out. The message, encoded in final, climb Mount Nataka, 1208. The signal for war. Far out on the Pacific, 6 Japanese carriers turned into the wind. Men strapped themselves into cockpits under red rising sun flags. They bowed their heads in prayer, then pulled their goggles down. Engines thundered to life. One by one, the planes launched into the pre-dawn dark, bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters, all bound for a place where the world still believed in peace. Back in Hawaii, Sunday morning would come like any other, the sound of waves, the smell of salt, and a sky too blue to imagine fire. But the storm was already on its way. The giant slept, dreaming of safety, unaware that before another dawn passed, it would awaken to a world forever changed. In the east, the sun rose not in peace, but in conquest. By 1941, the Empire of Japan stretched from Manchuria to the coasts of China. Its armies had swept through the continent like wildfire, brutal, relentless, and fueled by a belief in divine destiny. Tokyo's leaders spoke of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a grand vision of unity under Japanese rule. But beneath the banners and speeches lay hunger for oil, for iron, for the resources that would feed the machinery of empire. The United States had watched this expansion with growing unease. Reports from China told of atrocities, bombed villages, and endless columns of Japanese troops pushing deeper inland. The rape of Nanking, though years passed, still haunted Western minds. President Franklin D. Roosevelt condemned Japan's aggression, but America's heart still leaned toward isolation. Its people were weary of the idea of another war, their memories of the Great War's trenches and losses still fresh. Then, in July 1941, Roosevelt made a decision that would seal the path to Pearl Harbor. He froze all Japanese assets in the United States and imposed an oil embargo. For Japan, a nation that imported nearly 90% of its oil, it was a death sentence in slow motion. The empire's tanks, planes, and ships would grind to a halt within months. Diplomats protested, but Japan's militarists saw only one solution: take what they needed by force. Inside the imperial palace, the Council of War convened under tense silence. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, hard-faced and unwavering, spoke of survival. "If we do not fight," he declared, "we will be strangled. We must strike before the news tightens." But not everyone agreed. Across Tokyo, in a quiet study filled with cigarette smoke and maps, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto weighed the consequences. He was no fool, and certainly no fanatic. A graduate of Harvard, once a naval attaché in Washington, Yamamoto knew the power of the United States. He understood the industrial strength that slept behind its borders, the capacity to build, to fight, to endure. He warned his peers in the Imperial Navy, "If I am ordered to fight, I shall run wild for 6 months. After that, I can guarantee nothing." Still, Yamamoto was a soldier bound by duty. If war was inevitable, then Japan must strike first and strike decisively. He began to design a plan that defied convention and imagination alike, a bold, devastating blow that would cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet before it could rise. The plan was codenamed Operation Z. Its goal was simple in concept, impossible in ambition: sail 6 aircraft carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, across the Pacific Ocean under complete radio silence, launch over 350 aircraft, and destroy the American fleet anchored at Pearl Harbor. The attack would come without warning, without declaration, and without mercy. Yamamoto's subordinates studied every detail. The depth of the harbor, the schedules of American ships, the positions of anti-aircraft batteries, even the direction of the early morning sun. Spies in Honolulu sent coded messages, disguised as weather reports, describing the locations of battleships and airfields. The Japanese Navy trained in secret bays along the Kuriil Islands. Pilots practiced torpedo runs in shallow waters, learning to adjust their weapons so they wouldn't bury themselves in the harbor mud. Mechanics modified bombs to pierce armor plate. Every man understood, failure meant ruin, success meant destiny. Meanwhile, diplomacy continued, a theater of illusion. In Washington, Japanese envoys spoke of peace, trade, and mutual understanding. They bowed and smiled, even as the fleet steamed eastward across the North Pacific. The final note, a 14-part message from Tokyo, was on its way, a message that would break relations only hours before the first bombs fell. In Tokyo, Emperor Hirohito received the final briefing. He listened, silent and unreadable. Outside, the city was hushed under winter clouds, the lights of the imperial palace glowing faintly through the cold night. The decision had been made. The empire would roll the dice against fate itself. As the Japanese task force gathered off the coast of Hitokapa Bay, the men stood on the decks of their carriers and bowed toward the east, toward the rising sun painted on their banners and wings. Yamamoto watched from the bridge of his flagship, the Akagi, his face expressionless. He knew the plan's brilliance, and he knew its doom. On November 26, 1941, under a sky heavy with snow, the fleet slipped from harbor and vanished into the vastness of the Pacific. Radio silence fell like a shroud. No one spoke of home again. The waves carried them onward, a silent armada of vengeance and destiny. They called it the thunderclap from a clear sky. An empire's last gamble. A nation's awakening yet to come. And far away, under the same stars, America slept, still unaware that history was already on its way, carried by the rising sun. In the quiet offices of Washington, D.C., the faint hum of decoding machines filled the air. Rows of men and women bent over cipher sheets and intercepted radio chatter, searching for meaning inside strings of numbers and symbols. The Japanese diplomatic code, codenamed Purple, had been partially broken. Each day, messages from Tokyo's embassies around the world arrived in fragments. Each day, analysts pieced them together, trying to hear what was hidden between the lines. They caught whispers of something coming. Orders to burn codebooks. Instructions for Japanese embassies to destroy sensitive documents. Encrypted references to a date of importance. The clues were there, scattered like leaves in a storm, but not enough to form a picture. Some believed the target would be the Philippines. Others thought Thailand, or perhaps even British Singapore. No one imagined the blow would fall on Hawaii, the peaceful harbor they considered untouchable. In the weeks before December 7th, the cables from Tokyo grew more urgent. A 14-part message, the final one, was decoded in pieces, its meaning dark and unmistakable. Diplomatic relations with the United States were about to end. The warning should have set off alarms across the Pacific, but it didn't. Information moved too slowly, buried under layers of bureaucracy. Army intelligence had one part. Naval intelligence had another. The right people never saw the full message at the same time. Across the ocean, in Pearl Harbor, Sunday morning preparations went on as usual. Sailors wrote letters home, attended chapel, or queued for breakfast. In the airfields around Oahu, aircraft gleamed in the sunlight, lined neatly in rows, a precaution against sabotage, not air attack. The harbor was calm, reflecting the early tropical sky. And then came the radar. At Opana Point, two young radar operators, George Elliott and Joseph Lockard, manned their early warning station before dawn. The radar screen flickered, and then, a sudden burst of light. A massive formation of aircraft appeared, approaching from the north, less than 100 miles away. Startled, Elliott called the information center in Honolulu. The officer on duty listened, then laughed softly. "Don't worry about it," he said. "Those are probably our B-17s coming in from the mainland." The radar crew watched the blip move closer until the signal faded in static. They packed up their gear and went for breakfast. At sea, Japanese carrier pilots tightened their flight goggles as the sun rose behind them. Above Oahu, clouds drifted lazily, soft and white, the sky as innocent as the world below believed it to be. In Washington, teleprinters clattered. The last decoded message, Japan's final note, reached the State Department too late. Secretary of State Cordell Hull read it with grim clarity. "This means war." But by then, war had already begun. Back in Pearl Harbor, a lone sailor stood on the deck of the USS Arizona, the air thick with the smell of salt and diesel. He glanced at the horizon, where a faint hum, distant, rhythmic, almost musical, grew louder with every passing second. It was still early. The water was still calm. And America, still unaware, was seconds away from awakening to fire. Under a gray November sky, an armada slipped away from the shores of Japan, unseen, unheard, and bound for destiny. The sea was restless, heavy with cold, and the decks of 6 great carriers gleamed like ghosts in the dawn. On board the flagship Akagi, Admiral Chichi Nagumo stood at the rail in silence, the chill wind tugging at his coat. Below him, sailors moved with precision, no shouting, no signals, no radios. Only hand gestures and the quiet rhythm of preparation. Every man knew that sound could betray them. Every wave carried the weight of a secret that would change the world. The fleet was called the Kido Butai, the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled. 6 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, escorted by cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. Over 400 aircraft waited in their bellies like coiled steel dragons. Torpedo bombers, dive bombers, fighters, each marked with the red rising sun. Behind them, in the cold ports of Japan, wives and children waved at empty horizons, not knowing where their sons and husbands had gone. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who conceived the plan, watched from his own command post in Tokyo. He had ordered complete radio silence. No messages, no transmissions, not a single word would leave the fleet until after the strike. The Pacific was vast enough to hide even giants. And for 12 days, the sea itself became their shield. The men on board knew little. They had trained endlessly, rehearsed target patterns, studied silhouettes of battleships and airfields. But the destination, Pearl Harbor, was spoken only in whispers. On the Akagi, pilots sat in briefing rooms lit by dim red bulbs. Commanders pointed to photographs of a faraway harbor, rows of battleships, airstrips, fuel depots. Their leader, Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, stood before them, his voice calm but electric. "Our mission is to strike a single, fatal blow. We will cripple their fleet before they can respond. We will awaken the sleeping giant, and destroy him before he rises." Some pilots smiled. Others said nothing. They knew what this meant. The odds of survival were slim. They would fly low through anti-aircraft fire, over burning ships and exploding munitions. Many would never see Japan again. And yet, to fail would be worse, dishonor greater than death. As the fleet moved eastward, the weather turned foul. Winds howled across the open sea, waves broke over the decks, and icy rain soaked the men standing watch. But the storm, to Nagumo, was a gift, a natural cloak to conceal them from American reconnaissance. The Pacific, vast and indifferent, swallowed their presence whole. Life aboard the carriers settled into tense routine. Pilots checked and rechecked their aircraft. Mechanics polished propellers and tightened bolts until their hands went raw. At night, the ships moved in total blackout, no lights, no music, no laughter. Only the sound of engines, and the sea tapping softly against steel hulls. In the mess halls, men wrote final letters to families they would never see again. Some prayed to the emperor. Others whispered to themselves, tracing the edges of photographs hidden in their pockets. On December 6, the fleet reached its position, 230 miles north of Oahu. The ocean was calm now, deceptively gentle. Nagumo ordered the final briefing. Commanders gathered on deck, their breath forming small clouds in the cold morning air. The admiral unrolled a map and pointed south, the black dot that marked Pearl Harbor. "Tomorrow," he said, "we strike." That night, the ship slowed to a crawl. Engines hummed softly beneath the decks. Above them, the sky was clear, stars scattered like shards of glass. Pilots slept in their flight gear, their dreams haunted by the weight of the mission. And in the stillness before dawn, one could almost hear it, the pulse of history waiting to begin. In a few hours, they would take to the skies and carve their names into the story of nations. But for now, the fleet moved through the dark like shadows on the sea. 6 carriers, thousands of men, and the silence before the storm that would awaken the world. The morning of December 7th, 1941, broke over Oahu like any other Sunday, golden light spilling over the green ridges of the Kula Mountains, soft trade winds stirring palm leaves, and the Pacific glimmering like glass. No one thought of war that morning. At Pearl Harbor, the air was filled with routine, the clatter of breakfast trays, the sound of typewriters in offices, the hum of diesel engines preparing for another calm day. On the USS Arizona, sailors leaned over railings writing letters home. On the USS West Virginia, a chaplain rehearsed his sermon for Sunday service, faith, duty, and the promise of peace. Across the harbor, the Marine Band tuned their instruments for the 8 o'clock flag raising. The notes of brass and woodwind floated lazily across the still water. In nearby Honolulu, children ran through quiet streets toward church. Mothers hung laundry in the soft sun. A radio played Chattanooga Choo Choo. The day felt light, endless, and safe, an island morning unshaken by the storms that consumed the rest of the world. Then, at 7:02 a.m., the first whisper of the coming storm appeared on radar, a massive cluster of dots approaching from the north. The 2 young radar operators, Lockhart and Elliott, stared at the glowing screen in disbelief. So many planes. So close. They called headquarters. A bored lieutenant answered. "Don't worry about it," he said. "That's probably the B-17s flying in from California." And with that, the warning died on the wire. Over the Pacific, the first wave of 183 Japanese aircraft roared through the clouds, bombers, torpedo planes, and Zero fighters, glinting like silver daggers in the rising sun. Their leader, Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, peered down through the glass of his cockpit at the Emerald Island below. The harbor came into view, calm, unsuspecting, beautiful. He lifted his radio, his voice sharp and steady. "Tora! Tora! Tora!" The coded signal, Tiger, 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 meaning total surprise, had been achieved. Below, the sailors of Pearl Harbor heard a distant rumble. Some thought it was thunder. Then the sound grew, a low, steady roar that rolled over the island like the earth itself was awakening. Men stepped out onto decks, shielding their eyes from the morning sun. On the horizon, a line of dark specks shimmered, wings catching the light, sunlight on steel, sunlight on fate. At 7:55 a.m., the first bombs fell. The quiet of paradise shattered in a single heartbeat. The first explosion struck Ford Island, sending a column of fire into the sky. A second hit the USS Oklahoma, the blast tearing open her hull. Across the harbor, sailors shouted, stumbled, reached for weapons that weren't ready, for orders that hadn't come. Buglers sounded general quarters, their notes breaking mid-blow as shock waves rolled through the decks. On shore, church bells began to ring, not for worship, but for warning. The Japanese formation dove out of the sun, the red circles on their wings bright against the blue. Bombs screamed through the air. Torpedoes sliced the harbor's surface, trails of white foam racing toward battleships lined in perfect rows, like targets in a shooting gallery. At Hickam Field, American pilots sprinted toward their planes, only to see them erupt in flame before they could climb aboard. On the Arizona's deck, sailors tried to man anti-aircraft guns that had been locked for inspection. Some fought with pistols, others with nothing but their hands and courage. For a moment, there was disbelief, a paralyzing, impossible question in every mind: is this real? And then came the fire. Oil tanks burst into towering infernos. Black smoke rolled across the harbor like a living thing, choking the sky. The band on the USS Nevada dropped their instruments and ran for the guns. Men dove into burning water, the surface slick with oil, the air filled with screams and explosions. And amid it all, the sun still shone, warm and golden over the island, indifferent to the horror below. Within minutes, the illusion of peace was gone. The war that America had tried to ignore had arrived on its doorstep, carried on the wings of the rising sun. In that moment, as the world turned from morning light to fire, a nation awoke. And nothing, anywhere on earth, would ever be the same again. The morning sun blazed over Oahu, bright and merciless. At 7:49 a.m., Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, from the cockpit of his Nakajima B-5N bomber, looked down upon the glimmering waters of Pearl Harbor and uttered the words that would echo through eternity. Tora! 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 Tiger! 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 The code meant one thing: total surprise had been achieved. Below, the harbor lay still, battleships at anchor, aircraft lined neatly on runways, sailors unaware that history was seconds from fire. Then, like thunder breaking the calm, the first wave struck. Out of the sky came a storm of metal and flame. Japanese dive bombers plunged almost vertically, their engines screaming as they dropped their payloads with surgical precision. The first torpedoes struck the USS West Virginia and Oklahoma, slicing through their hulls like knives through paper. Within minutes, the Oklahoma rolled to her side, trapping hundreds of men below decks. The attack was a symphony of chaos. Machine guns rattled, bombs detonated, and oil tanks ignited in massive fireballs. The air was filled with smoke, shrapnel, and disbelief. At Battleship Row, sailors scrambled from their bunks, barefoot and half-dressed, sprinting to their stations. Some tried to man anti-aircraft guns, only to find them locked or unloaded. Others dragged the wounded through burning corridors as explosions tore the ships apart. At 7:55 a.m., the USS Arizona took a direct hit. A 1,760-pound armor-piercing bomb plunged through her forward deck and ignited her magazine. For a moment, there was silence, a heartbeat between life and annihilation, and then a blinding flash erupted. The Arizona lifted from the water as if struck by lightning. The explosion split her in two, hurling steel, flame, and men into the sky. A shockwave rippled across the harbor, knocking sailors from neighboring decks. In that instant, over 1,100 men died, entombed forever in the vessel that had been their home. The air filled with screams and smoke. The sea turned black with oil and red with blood. Ships burned like floating volcanoes, their masts twisted into grotesque silhouettes. The USS Nevada tried to make a desperate run for the open sea, but she too was hit, her deck aflame as her crew fought to beach her before she sank. On Ford Island, planes exploded in chain reactions as bombs fell across the runways. Mechanics and pilots were blown apart where they stood. The Hickam Field barracks crumbled under strafing fire, soldiers caught in their sleep, never even reaching their rifles. Everywhere, the same disbelief. This wasn't an exercise. This wasn't a drill. It was war, real, and it was already too late. Japanese pilots moved with cold precision. They strafed lifeboats, anti-aircraft emplacements, and even ambulances. Their leader, Fukuda, circled high above, watching the destruction unfold exactly as planned. But even he, a man of discipline and duty, felt a chill as the harbor below became an inferno. In the chaos, acts of heroism flared like sparks in the dark. Aboard the USS California, sailors stayed at their posts as the ship flooded, keeping power running for other vessels. On the Oklahoma, trapped men pounded on the hull for hours, tapping in Morse code as rescue crews fought to cut them free. Nurses at the Naval Hospital tore sheets into bandages and worked without pause, their white uniforms stained with blood and smoke. The sound was overwhelming, the roar of flames, the cries for help, the drone of engines overhead. Oil burned on the surface of the harbor, creating rivers of fire that carried the dead. A sailor leapt into the water to escape the heat, only to find himself swimming through flame. Others joined him, their skin blistering as they searched for survivors among the wreckage. By 8:30 a.m., the first wave was over. The harbor was unrecognizable, a floating graveyard beneath a sky blackened with smoke. Ships still burned. Men still screamed. The Pacific Fleet, once the pride of America, lay crippled in its own home waters. Above the carnage, Fukuda turned his plane toward the north, scanning the destruction one final time. He could see the fires of Pearl Harbor from miles away, a vast, boiling wound on the surface of the sea. He keyed his radio and spoke calmly into the silence. The attack is successful. Mission accomplished. But below him, amid the wreckage and ruin, something else had awakened, something he could not see. From the ashes of that harbor, from the shattered decks and burning skies, a resolve was taking shape, quiet, fierce, and unstoppable. The world had been set aflame. And America, once struck, would rise to answer in kind. Beneath the black smoke that rolled across Pearl Harbor, the line between life and death blurred into chaos. The morning sun was gone now, swallowed by clouds of fire and ash. The air was thick, hot, choking, alive with the stench of oil and burning flesh. Ships burned like pyres, their decks buckling, their guns silent. Yet amid the horror, men fought not the enemy, but the sea, the smoke, and the suffocating dark that filled their lungs. Deep below the decks of the USS Oklahoma, sailors clawed at twisted metal in total darkness. The ship had rolled onto her side within minutes, trapping hundreds below. Water rushed through the corridors, rising inch by inch, carrying debris and bodies alike. Men found small air pockets, whispering prayers in the dark. One tapped frantically on the bulkhead, a desperate Morse signal for rescue, still alive, still here. Above, welding torches sparked as crews worked through the night to cut holes in the overturned hull. They pulled out 32 men alive. 400 more never saw daylight again. On the USS Arizona, there were no rescues, only fire. The explosion had ripped her open, the deck glowing red with molten steel. The ship still burned from within, flames fed by fuel and ammunition. Sailors jumped overboard, their uniforms aflame, plunging into a sea slick with oil. The oil itself caught fire, black and thick, burning across the water's surface. Men swam through it anyway, faces barely above the heat, hands outstretched for anything solid. Some never made it. Others were pulled aboard small boats by fellow sailors, their skin blistered, eyes wild and unfocused. One rescuer said later, "It was like dragging ghosts out of hell." At Fort Island, the ground shook from each detonation. Hangars burned. Ammunition cooked off in violent bursts, echoing like thunder. Medics worked under strafing fire, dragging the wounded behind makeshift barriers. One Navy corpsman pressed his hand against a sailor's chest wound, refusing to let go even as shrapnel tore through the air around him. In the hospitals of Honolulu, nurses were already overwhelmed. They had no warning, only the sudden roar of planes overhead, then the endless parade of wounded. They tore up bedsheets for bandages, used whiskey for antiseptic, and worked until their arms trembled. Blood soaked through their uniforms, but none stopped. Outside, Ambulances filled with casualties sped past civilians who stood frozen in disbelief, watching columns of smoke rise from the harbor. At Hickam Field, fire crews fought impossible odds, planes exploding, hangars collapsing, men burned beyond recognition. A lone pilot, his aircraft destroyed before takeoff, crawled through burning debris to pull another man from the wreckage. His hands were raw, his face blackened with soot, but he went back 3 times. He didn't remember how many he saved, only that he couldn't stop hearing their screams. By mid-morning, the harbor was a furnace. Flames licked at the sky. The water shimmered red and orange. The sound of gunfire had faded, replaced by the hiss of burning oil and the cries of the wounded. Sailors moved through the wreckage like ghosts, dazed, barefoot, covered in ash. Some searched for friends they would never find. Others sat in silence, staring at the blackened water that had once been their home. In the city, the people of Honolulu did what they could. Civilians carried stretchers, opened their homes to the injured, and gave blood until they fainted. Church bells rang across the island, calling for volunteers, for prayers, for anything that might bring order to the chaos. From the hills, smoke could be seen rising over Pearl Harbor like a second horizon. Children asked if the volcano had erupted again. Their mothers could not answer. By noon, the attack was over. The enemy had vanished back into the sky, leaving only silence behind, a silence broken by the crackle of fire and the low moan of the dying. That afternoon, as rescue crews worked among the wrecks, one officer looked across the harbor and whispered, "This isn't war. This is slaughter." But amid that slaughter, something else burned, fierce and unseen. The courage of men who refused to abandon their posts. The compassion of strangers who rushed toward the fire. The strength of a nation that, in a single morning, had lost its innocence but found its will to fight. The harbor burned for days, the smoke staining the sky. The scent of oil and ash lingered for weeks. And beneath the waters of Pearl Harbor, the dead lay silent, the first to fall in a war that had only just begun. By 8:40 a.m., the smoke from the first attack still hung over Pearl Harbor like a funeral shroud. Ships burned. Men screamed. The water itself was on fire. And then, out of the haze, came the second wave. Another 170 Japanese aircraft, their engines whining in perfect formation, swept down from the north. These were the killers sent to finish what the first wave had begun. They came in low, fast, and without mercy, dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters, their red insignia flashing through the smoke like open wounds against the sky. On the decks of the surviving ships, sailors pointed upward in disbelief. "Not again," one whispered, and then the sky opened once more. The first bombs fell on the USS Nevada, the only battleship able to move under her own power. She had already been hit once, but her crew, defiant and desperate, had managed to get her engines running. The Nevada began a slow crawl toward the open sea, her hull bleeding smoke. As she moved, the Japanese spotted her, a moving target in a harbor of corpses. They descended upon her like hawks. Bomb after bomb slammed into her deck. Torpedoes ripped into her sides. The Nevada's bridge burst into flame, her guns still firing even as her crew was cut down. When it became clear she would sink and block the channel, the captain ordered her beached. The ship shuddered, grounded near Hospital Point, burning, battered, but alive. Her flag never came down. Across the harbor, the USS California and West Virginia were already sinking. Their crews refused to abandon them, forming bucket lines to fight the fires, dragging wounded men to the upper decks. One sailor stayed at his anti-aircraft gun long after his hands were shredded by shrapnel. He would not leave until the last plane was gone. At the airfields, Hickam, Wheeler, and Bellows, the second wave fell like a storm of iron. rows of aircraft, parked wingtip to guard against sabotage, were reduced to molten wrecks in minutes. Pilots sprinted across the tarmac, trying to reach the few undamaged planes. One group managed to get a handful of P-36 fighters airborne, young men launching into a sky filled with enemies they could barely see through the smoke. They fought anyway, against impossible odds. Over Ava Field, Lieutenant Phil Rasmussen, still in his pajamas, shot down a Japanese Zero, one of only a few American victories that morning. At Hickam Field, the barracks were unrecognizable, a skeletal ruin filled with dust and cries for help. Nurses and medics worked in the open air, wrapping wounds with torn shirts, pouring water over burns, comforting those beyond saving. Bombs fell close enough to shake the ground beneath their feet, but none of them ran. By now, the harbor had become a maelstrom of fire and courage. The anti-aircraft batteries, long silent, finally roared to life. Gunners fired blindly through the smoke, the air thick with tracer rounds. Some planes fell, torn apart by lucky hits, crashing into the water or nearby hillsides. But for every one downed, 5 more swooped in. The Americans were fighting back, but it was too late. In downtown Honolulu, civilians took cover as stray bullets and shrapnel fell like rain. Storefronts shattered, and fires spread through the docks. Telephone operators refused to leave their posts, relaying desperate messages between bases: "We are under attack." Repeat. This is no drill. On the harbor's edge, sailors formed human chains, pulling survivors from the flaming water. Their skin blistered from the heat, their lungs raw from smoke, but they would not stop. One officer recalled later, the harbor looked like the mouth of hell, but inside that hell, men became more than men. By 9:45 a.m., the second wave began to withdraw. The Japanese had done what they came to do, destroyed 8 battleships, 188 aircraft, and over 2,400 American lives. Their leader, Commander Fukuda, looked down once more as his plane turned north toward the open ocean. He saw the harbor engulfed in smoke and fire, a vast scar carved into paradise. Below, the Americans stood among the wreckage, dazed but unbroken. The fires would burn for 2 more days. The oil slicks for weeks. But already, amid the smoke and silence, a different kind of fire had been lit, one that no enemy could extinguish. The second wave had left the harbor in ruins. But in destroying it, they had awakened something far greater. The will of a nation that would rise from the ashes and never again be caught sleeping beneath the morning sun. In Washington, the first word came in fragments, broken sentences crackling over shortwave and telephone lines. No one believed it at first. Reports spoke of planes attacking Pearl Harbor, of explosions in Honolulu, of ships burning in the harbor. The signals were faint, garbled, and unbelievable. The United States, powerful, untouched, at peace, was under attack. Inside the Navy Department, teleprinters clattered out updates that contradicted one another. Some said the fleet had been damaged, others that the entire Pacific Command was gone. Admirals shouted across rooms, aides sprinted down marble corridors. Every few minutes, a new message arrived, each one worse than the last. At the White House, President Franklin D. Roosevelt sat at his desk, a half-finished lunch growing cold beside him. He had been expecting bad news. The Japanese envoys had delivered their cryptic message earlier that morning, but not this. An aide burst into the Oval Office and handed him a telegram. Roosevelt read it once, then again. Air raid on Pearl Harbor. This is no drill. He closed his eyes for a moment, then murmured to himself, they finally did it. Within minutes, Washington became a storm of movement. Cabinet members, military chiefs, and intelligence officers crowded into the map room. Radio operators struggled to make contact with Hawaii, the lines jammed, the signals faint through static. Outside, reporters flooded the streets, shouting headlines to editors, "Japan attacks U.S. fleet." No one could grasp the scale. No one yet knew the numbers, only that the Pacific had erupted into war. Across the country, Americans turned to their radios. Families gathered in living rooms, factory workers stood frozen beside machines, truck drivers pulled over on highways. The voice of CBS's John Daly trembled through the airwaves. "We interrupt this program. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, by air. President Roosevelt has just announced the attack." Silence followed. Then disbelief. A farmer in Kansas turned to his wife, whispering, "Where's Pearl Harbor?" In New York, the streets grew still. In small towns, church bells rang. In movie theaters, projectionists stopped the reels, switching the audio to the live broadcast. Audiences gasped as the news reached them in the dark. In Honolulu, amid fire and smoke, radio operators tried to send word home. Their signals, shaky, rushed, desperate, carried across the Pacific. "Attack ongoing. Fleet burning. Request immediate assistance." Static swallowed half their words. But it was enough. By late afternoon, the truth spread faster than fear. Every major radio network broke into scheduled programming. Bulletins repeated the same words again and again: "Pearl Harbor has been attacked. Casualties unknown. The Pacific Fleet has suffered heavy losses." Each broadcast tightened the knot of dread in the hearts of millions. In California, air raid drills began almost immediately. Coastal defenses went on alert, searchlights sweeping the skies. In Seattle and San Francisco, rumors flew: Japanese ships sighted offshore, submarines lurking near harbors. Children clung to their parents. Shopkeepers locked their doors. The illusion of America's safety, guarded by distance and ocean, was gone in a single day. Back in the White House, Roosevelt's face was pale but steady. Around him, the room buzzed with frantic energy, generals arguing, maps spread across the table, aides bringing casualty estimates written in pencil and fear. The president said nothing for a long moment, then looked up and spoke softly. "We must know everything, and we must act." Outside, the city darkened under a winter sky. The Washington Monument cast a long shadow across the empty streets. In homes from Maine to California, radios continued to hum, their static becoming the sound of a nation's awakening. And as night fell across the Pacific, the fires at Pearl Harbor still burned, red against black water. The last telegraph of the evening came through just after midnight, its words simple, terrible, and final. "The fleet is crippled. Many dead. More missing. This is not the end, but the beginning." Across the world, those words echoed into silence. The age of peace had ended. And America, wounded but unbroken, was now awake, a sleeping giant stirring to the sound of war. When the sun rose again over Oahu on December 8, 1941, the island no longer shimmered with tropical beauty. It lay scarred and blackened, the once blue harbor now an oil-slicked grave. The fires still smoldered, the water still burned. Ships that had been proud symbols of strength now sat half-submerged, their twisted masts jutting through the smoke like bones breaking the surface of the sea. The first full count came at dawn. 2,403 Americans dead. Over 1,100 wounded. 8 battleships sunk or crippled. Nearly 200 aircraft destroyed. The Pacific Fleet, the heart of America's naval power, gutted in a single morning. But the true number was not written in ink or typed in military reports. It came in the form of telegrams. Thousands of them, traveling across the ocean and into homes across the mainland. Each one began the same way: the Secretary of War regrets to inform you. In small towns and cities, mothers opened those envelopes with trembling hands. Some screamed. Others went quiet, holding the paper as if it might burn away the truth. In Honolulu, hundreds of families crowded outside military offices, waiting for names that would not come. The hospitals overflowed. The morgues, too. Nurses moved among the cots, whispering prayers under their breath as the moans of the wounded echoed through the night. On Ford Island, rescue crews still worked among the wreckage. Divers descended into the black waters, searching for survivors inside capsized ships. In the USS Oklahoma, they could hear faint tapping, men trapped below decks, alive but unreachable. Rescuers worked until their hands bled, cutting through steel as the hours slipped away. Some were saved. Many were not. For the sailors who lived, survival carried its own burden. They wandered through the ruins barefoot and silent, their faces gray with ash. Some searched for friends they would never find. Others stared into the harbor, watching the oil rise in dark, lazy swirls, the black tears of the Arizona. The water seemed to breathe, as if mourning with them. Across the Pacific, the Japanese strike force turned for home, their mission complete. Tokyo rejoiced. Radios blared victory songs. But one man, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, sat alone aboard his flagship, staring at the waves. He knew what his countrymen did not: Japan had not won a war that day. It had merely awakened one. He whispered to his aide, his voice heavy with dread. "I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant, and fill him with a terrible resolve." In Washington, the news swept through every office and home like a storm. Flags were lowered. Factories fell silent for a moment of mourning, then roared to life again with purpose. Men lined up at recruiting stations that stretched around city blocks. Old rifles were pulled from closets, sons kissed their mothers goodbye. America, the nation that had sworn to stay apart from the world's wars, now stood united by loss and vengeance. President Franklin D. Roosevelt spent the night drafting words that would echo for generations. He knew that grief alone was not enough. The country needed clarity, purpose, defiance. And so the next morning, in a trembling voice heard by millions, he spoke the words that gave history a name. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. As he spoke, the world seemed to hold its breath. It was no longer just about a harbor, or ships, or the lives lost beneath the waves. It was about a nation stripped of its innocence, a sleeping power roused to fury. The United States of America had been struck, but not broken. That night, across the country, church bells rang and candles burned in windows. Fathers stood a little taller. Mothers wept quietly. Children listened to their parents speak of duty and sacrifice. The shock of the day had begun to harden into resolve. In the harbor, the fires finally began to die. The sky cleared, revealing stars reflected in the water, a mirror of light above a graveyard below. And beneath those waters lay the still forms of men who, without warning or preparation, had become the first martyrs of a new world war. The day of infamy had passed, but its shadow stretched across oceans. In its wake came a nation reborn, its grief turned to steel, its fear to fire. And from that harbor of ruin, the first echoes of vengeance began to rise. The sun had barely risen over the American mainland when the shock began to ripple through the country. On radios in living rooms, cafes, and corner shops, the voice of a trembling announcer cut through the usual music and morning chatter. "We interrupt this program. Pearl Harbor has been attacked by Japanese aircraft. This is not a drill." Across farms in Iowa, tenements in New York, and small towns in the heartland, people froze where they stood. Mothers turned the volume up, their hands pressed to their mouths. factory workers gathered around portable radios, faces pale beneath the fluorescent lights. Priests stopped mid-sermon. On military bases, men ran to barracks before the words had even finished echoing. The first reaction was disbelief. Not here, not us. Then came the silence. And then, the sound of a nation awakening. Telegraph offices jammed with messages. Is my boy safe? Wives and parents flooded recruiting stations, desperate for news. At train depots, young men began to gather, some in uniform, some not yet called, but ready. In New York, traffic halted as headlines were pasted to the glass of Times Square news tickers. U.S. fleet attacked, many dead. Crowds stared upward, the murmur of thousands growing into a steady roar of anger and disbelief. In Chicago, a woman fainted on the street as she heard the name of her husband's ship, Arizona. By noon, the Red Cross had lines stretching down the block. People wanted to do something, anything. That night, President Franklin D. Roosevelt called his cabinet to the White House. Outside, the air was heavy with snow and uncertainty. Inside, the lights burned late. The Oval Office was filled with the sound of paper rustling, the low murmur of voices, and the steady clicking of typewriters. Generals and admirals stood around a large map of the Pacific, marked in red pens and black ink. Roosevelt listened to the latest casualty reports, his jaw tight, his hands trembling slightly as he held his cigarette holder. He turned to his advisors, his voice steady but low. "We are all in this together now." Those words hung in the air like a vow. Outside Washington, America was already changing. In Los Angeles, factories that once made cars began retooling for tanks and bombers. In Detroit, the auto plants worked through the night, sparks lighting the sky as machinery was stripped and rebuilt. In schools, teachers tried to explain to children why their brothers were being called to war. The first war bond posters went up that evening, red, white, and blue against the gray winter. Men enlisted in droves, some lied about their age to get in. In bars and homes, people sang softly to steady themselves, patriotic songs now tinged with grief. And yet, through the fear and confusion, something powerful stirred: resolve. The same people who, a day earlier, believed oceans could keep them safe now understood the truth: the war had come home. Across the nation, the line between peace and duty vanished. Factories, farms, shipyards, hospitals, all pulsed with new purpose. Mothers folded flags, fathers looked toward the horizon. The isolation of the previous decade shattered overnight, replaced by a unity the world had never seen. By midnight, America was no longer a sleeping nation. It was a nation wide awake, its grief hardening into steel, its sorrow turning into fire. The people did not yet know how long or terrible the coming war would be, only that they would face it together. And in that cold December darkness, the first sound of forging began. Not in the clang of hammers, but in the steady heartbeat of a nation reborn. The morning of December 8, 1941, dawned gray over Washington, D.C. The streets were quiet, lined with snow and soldiers. Inside the Capitol, thousands gathered in silence, waiting for a voice that would give shape to their grief and fury. At 12:30 p.m., President Franklin D. Roosevelt was wheeled into the House chamber. His face was calm, his expression composed, but the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. The packed gallery fell into silence as he adjusted his papers with trembling hands. Reporters held pencils poised above notepads. Radio microphones gleamed beneath the lights. Then, his voice, low, steady, and deliberate, filled the room. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The words struck like hammer blows. They carried not just anger, but precision, a cold, righteous fury wrapped in restraint. Every syllable burned with conviction. He described the treachery, how Japanese diplomats had continued to speak of peace even as their bombs fell upon Hawaii. He spoke of the devastation, ships destroyed, lives lost, families torn apart. And then he turned his gaze toward the future, his tone sharpening. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people, in their righteous might, will win through to absolute victory. The chamber erupted in applause, not polite, but thunderous, unstoppable. Senators rose to their feet. Congressmen pounded their desks. Even the reporters, hardened by years of politics and war news, wiped tears from their eyes. Outside the Capitol, crowds gathered around radios, their faces lifted toward loudspeakers mounted on cars and storefronts. Across the nation, millions listened in factories, classrooms, kitchens, the voice of their president carried through static and distance, binding them together. Everywhere, the same feeling, grief had turned to resolve. Isolationism, the belief that America could remain apart from the world's turmoil, was dead. When Roosevelt finished speaking, he raised his hand slightly and looked across the sea of faces before him. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph. So help us God. The room thundered with applause once more. Less than an hour later, both houses of Congress voted to declare war on Japan. The Senate's vote, 82-0. The House, 388-1, a lone dissenting voice drowned in the roar of unity. Outside, the winter air rang with cheers. Flags waved from every window. Men who had never worn a uniform before marched straight to enlistment offices. Women volunteered for the Red Cross in the factories that would soon become America's arsenal. The United States, struck and wounded, had risen to its feet. Pearl Harbor had ended one era and begun another, the era of total commitment. Across the Pacific, Japanese commanders celebrated their triumph. But in that moment, in that speech, they had sealed their fate. For Roosevelt's words did more than declare war, they defined it. They transformed a stunned and grieving people into an army of millions. They turned outrage into unity, fear into purpose, and sorrow into iron. The world had changed in a single morning at Pearl Harbor. Now, in the echo of Roosevelt's words, the change became permanent. The day of infamy had passed. And the age of vengeance, sacrifice, and victory had begun. The fires had burned out, but the smoke still clung to the water. Pearl Harbor, once alive with sound and motion, had gone eerily quiet. Only the faint hiss of oil rising from the wrecks broke the silence, slow, steady, eternal. The sea itself seemed to mourn. In the days after the attack, the harbor became a place of ghosts. The once proud ships of the Pacific Fleet now lay torn and twisted, their hulls split open, their decks tilted toward the sky. The USS Arizona was nothing but a blackened skeleton of steel, her guns melted, her bridge gone. The Oklahoma rested upside down, her hull rising from the water like the back of a great, dying beast. But within those broken ships, life still clung to the dark. Divers from the Navy Yard, their faces set with grim resolve, began the search. They worked in the toxic water, thick with oil, ash, and death, guided by touch alone. Their air hoses coiled through the black depths as they pried open hatches and forced their way into twisted corridors. Each dive was a descent into another world, a place without light or air, where time itself seemed to stop. In the Oklahoma, they found signs of life, faint tapping from deep inside the hull. Trapped sailors, sealed within pockets of air, were alive. The rescuers worked frantically, cutting through the steel with torches. Each strike of a hammer echoed like a heartbeat. But the ship was massive, the metal thick. water seeped in faster than they could cut. For 3 long days, the sound of tapping continued. Then, slowly, it faded, first one, then another, until there was only silence. One diver later wrote, "That silence was the worst sound I ever heard." Inside the Arizona, there was no hope at all. The explosion that tore through her had killed more than 1,100 men in seconds. Their bodies lay entombed in the wreck, brothers, friends, fathers, still at their posts. The Navy declared her a tomb. The flags flew at half-mast above the still smoking water, and the harbor became both grave and shrine. For the survivors, the days that followed were a blur of exhaustion and guilt. They worked to recover the dead, to clear the wreckage, to bury their comrades in makeshift cemeteries carved into the red Hawaiian soil. Some refused to rest, their hands blistered and bleeding from the effort. Others stood by the harbor at night, staring into the black water where friends had vanished, unable to speak. A machinist from the West Virginia wrote home, "I can still hear them down there. I don't know if it's real or just in my head." That was the burden of those who lived, the knowledge that survival came at the cost of leaving others behind. Divers continued their grim work for weeks, bringing up fragments of the fallen, helmets, boots, letters sealed in pockets. Each recovery was sacred. They learned to recognize ships not by their names, but by their ghosts, the Arizona's twisted guns, the Oklahoma's upside-down hull, the Utah's silent lean toward the shore. Even as they raised what they could, much of the fleet remained where it had fallen. The harbor floor became a cemetery. Over the following months, the oil continued to leak from the Arizona's sunken heart, black ribbons drifting to the surface, spreading slowly across the water. The sailors called it the tears of the dead. And still, the survivors carried their memories like wounds that never closed. Some returned to service, fighting across the Pacific to honor those who could not. Others went home and never spoke of that day again. But every December, when the wind was still and the water calm, they said they could hear it again, the faint tapping beneath the waves, the echoes of the men they left behind. Pearl Harbor had become more than a battlefield. It was now a graveyard of heroes, a place where the sea itself kept vigil. And where silence, not sound, told the story of sacrifice. In Tokyo, the news arrived before dawn, a single coded transmission that electrified a nation. Climb Mount Nataka. 1208. The operation was complete. Pearl Harbor had burned. Within hours, Japan erupted in celebration. Newspapers printed extra editions with triumphant headlines. Church bells and temple gongs rang across the capital. People poured into the streets waving flags emblazoned with the red rising sun. Radio announcers declared victory with pride in their voices. The Imperial Navy has dealt a crushing blow to the arrogant Americans. Children in schools bowed before portraits of the Emperor, shouting, "Banzai," until their voices broke. For the people of Japan, it seemed divine proof of destiny. They had humbled the West, shattered the myth of American invincibility. After years of sanctions, embargoes, and diplomatic humiliation, the empire had struck back, not just at a fleet, but at the world order itself. At the Navy Ministry, officers toasted the success of the Kido Butai. Maps were unfurled across tables, pins moved rapidly across the Pacific. Hong Kong would fall within weeks. Guam and Wake Island soon after. In the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur's forces were already retreating. The rising sun seemed to spread across the Pacific like dawn itself. The Imperial Japanese Navy had done what no one thought possible, crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet in a single morning. Everywhere, the talk was of conquest and inevitability. Tokyo's newspapers called it the greatest victory in the history of the world. But amid the cheers and applause, one man did not celebrate. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the attack, stood alone in his cabin aboard the flagship Nagato, far from Tokyo's jubilation. He read the reports with quiet unease. Every success, every target destroyed, weighed heavier on him. To his officers, he showed calm satisfaction. To his aide, he spoke the words that history would remember. "I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." He understood what others refused to see. Pearl Harbor had not ended America's power, it had provoked it. In striking with such force, Japan had united its enemy, turning a distant giant into a wrathful one. For now, though, the illusion of invincibility held. Japanese forces swept across the Pacific in a wave of victories. The British fortress of Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day. Guam and Wake Island, after brief but valiant defenses, were overrun. The Philippines descended into chaos, Manila bombed, Bataan encircled. Everywhere the Japanese flag rose, it was met with awe and fear. The world watched, stunned, as the empire of the rising sun expanded farther and faster than any had imagined. Tokyo glowed with lights that winter, the city alive with celebration. But beneath the euphoria, the architects of Japan's war machine knew what the public did not: the fuel, the steel, the resources that made their victories possible were finite. The oil taken from conquered lands would not last. And behind the calm seas of December lay a gathering storm, one born not of surprise, but of vengeance. For a few fleeting months, the empire stood triumphant, its banners flying from Singapore to the South China Sea. But far to the east, across the vastness of the Pacific, America was stirring. Factories thundered, shipyards roared, and the sound of engines echoed from coast to coast. Yamamoto was right. The giant was awake. And soon, it would come for them. The smoke over Pearl Harbor had barely settled before the United States began to burn with something far greater: determination. The grief that had blanketed the nation in silence now ignited into fury. Across every city, factory, and farm, a single phrase spread like wildfire: "Remember Pearl Harbor." In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his advisors moved swiftly. There would be no hesitation, no delay. The machinery of democracy was shifting into the machinery of war. Factories that once built cars, radios, and washing machines began retooling overnight. Ford's assembly lines no longer turned out sedans, but bombers, the B-24 Liberator rolling off the line in Detroit like clockwork. General Motors, Chrysler, and Boeing joined in the transformation. Every rivet hammered, every engine forged, became an act of vengeance. The industrial might of America, long dormant in peace, came roaring to life. Women who had never stepped inside a factory now donned coveralls and welding goggles. The image of Rosie the Riveter appeared in posters and newspapers, sleeves rolled up, eyes fierce beneath her bandana. "We can do it." In cities across the nation, the night shift became a patriotic duty. The sound of hammers, engines, and sirens filled the air from California to New York. Recruitment stations overflowed with volunteers. Boys barely out of high school lined up shoulder to shoulder, their faces lit with grim resolve. Many carried photographs of brothers or friends who had died at Pearl Harbor. Others simply wanted to fight, to do something, anything, after the shock of that Sunday morning. Within weeks, more than 1 million men had enlisted. America, once divided by isolationism, was now united by outrage. Roosevelt's fireside chats turned mourning into momentum. "No matter how long it takes us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory." The newspapers printed those words in bold type. The songwriters answered with anthems of defiance. The phrase "Remember Pearl Harbor" appeared on billboards, ration books, and the sides of bombers. It was more than a slogan, it was a promise. Everywhere, the landscape of the nation changed. Men left home for training camps in Texas, California, and the Carolinas. Fields filled with barracks and tents. Railroads thundered with troop trains heading west, toward the Pacific. Women took over offices, buses, and factories. Children collected scrap metal and rubber for the war effort. Even Hollywood joined the fight, turning out newsreels and patriotic films that rallied hearts and hardened resolve. The transformation was total. In less than a year, the United States became what no other nation had ever achieved, a war machine of industry and spirit combined. Shipyards built Liberty ships faster than the enemy could sink them. Planes filled the skies over the Great Plains, lined up like flocks of iron birds ready to take flight. And yet, beneath the unity and pride, there was grief that never fully faded. Families clutched the telegrams that arrived after Pearl Harbor, the official words that never matched the reality of loss. But those sorrows became fuel. Each name engraved in memory added strength to the nation's purpose. In the Pacific, new ships already set sail, destroyers, cruisers, and carriers bearing names meant to replace those lost at Pearl. The USS Yorktown, the Enterprise, the Hornet, they carried with them the weight of vengeance and the spirit of redemption. By 1942, the sleeping giant Admiral Yamamoto had feared was fully awake, and now armed, focused, and unstoppable. The United States was no longer a bystander. It was a storm gathering across two oceans, an industrial titan that would soon change the fate of the world. The flames that had devoured Pearl Harbor had been answered. Not with despair, but with fire of another kind. The unyielding blaze of American retaliation. In the weeks following the attack, as smoke still drifted above the wreckage of Battleship Row, grief began to harden into questions. How had this happened? How had the most powerful navy in the world been blindsided on a calm Sunday morning? And, perhaps most painfully of all, who was to blame? The demand for answers came swiftly. Newspapers filled with anger and disbelief. Headlines shouted accusations, Navy caught asleep, and commanders failed to heed warnings. In Washington, the Roosevelt administration ordered an immediate investigation. The tragedy at Pearl Harbor could not simply be remembered, it had to be explained. At the center of the storm stood two men, Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and Lieutenant General Walter C. Short, in charge of the Army's defenses in Hawaii. Both had been respected officers, disciplined, competent, and loyal. Both had believed that, if war came, it would come slowly, perhaps weeks of diplomatic tension before the first shot. Neither imagined Japan capable of such audacity. But the investigation was unforgiving. Telegram logs, decoded messages, and intelligence summaries painted a damning picture of missed warnings. In the days before the attack, Washington had intercepted fragments of Japanese communications, messages about the breakdown of diplomacy, the destruction of secret codes, and reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor itself. Pieces of the puzzle that, in hindsight, formed a clear picture. But at the time, those fragments had been scattered across desks, drowned in bureaucracy, indecision, and disbelief. The Roberts Commission, established by President Roosevelt, convened in December 1941 to uncover the truth. Witnesses testified for hours, recounting the confusion, the delays, the errors that had compounded into catastrophe. Admiral Kimmel, pale and exhausted, faced the panel with quiet dignity. He accepted responsibility for the fleet but insisted, "No one informed me that war was imminent." General Short said the same, "We were prepared for sabotage, not for an air raid." Their defenses did little to sway public anger. The nation wanted accountability, and the faces of Kimmel and Short became symbols of failure. Within days, both men were relieved of their commands, dismissed not for cowardice, but for the sin of being unprepared. In private, many within the military sympathized. The blame, they whispered, was not theirs alone. Washington had received the 14-part message, Japan's final communication before war, but it had reached Hawaii too late. Radar operators who had detected incoming aircraft had their warnings dismissed as a squadron of B-17s. In truth, the entire system had failed, not through malice, but through human error. Still, the search for a scapegoat continued. Congressional hearings stretched into 1942. Politicians demanded to know if Roosevelt himself had known beforehand. Conspiracy theories whispered that he had allowed the attack to draw America into war. No credible evidence ever proved such claims, yet the suspicion lingered, a stain on an otherwise unified front. Admiral Kimmel retired quietly, burdened by the weight of what might have been. He never recovered from the blow to his honor. In later years, when asked about Pearl Harbor, he simply said, "I was at the wrong place at the wrong time, and the country needed someone to blame." General Short lived long enough to see history soften its judgment. Decades later, historians would agree, the failure at Pearl Harbor was not of one man, but of many. A tragedy born from overconfidence, communication breakdowns, and the limits of imagination. The ships could be rebuilt. The dead could be honored. But the trust in infallibility, the belief that America was untouchable, was gone forever. In the ashes of Pearl Harbor, the question of blame became a mirror reflecting a greater truth. That even the mightiest nations can be undone not by enemies alone, but by the blindness that comes before the storm. The world that Pearl Harbor shattered did not stay still for long, it ignited. In the weeks and months that followed December 7, 1941, the Pacific became a burning map of red banners and falling stars. The rising sun moved like a storm across oceans and continents, devouring everything in its path. Japan struck with terrifying speed and precision. From the jungles of Malaya to the beaches of the Philippines, from Burma to New Guinea, the empire advanced without mercy. Its armies, fueled by discipline and belief in divine destiny, seemed unstoppable. Manila, once called the Pearl of the Orient, fell in January 1942. American and Filipino troops fought desperately on the Bataan Peninsula, holding out against hunger, disease, and overwhelming odds. When their ammunition finally ran dry, surrender became the only option, but mercy never came. The prisoners, 76,000 men, were forced to march more than 60 miles under a punishing tropical sun. Those who collapsed were shot, bayonet, or left for dead. Locals watched in horror as bodies lined the roadsides. It would come to be known as the Bataan Death March, one of the darkest chapters of the war. In Singapore, the British fortress that Churchill once called the Gibraltar of the East, Japanese forces struck from the north, where defenses were weakest. After only a week of fighting, the city surrendered. Over 80,000 British and Commonwealth troops became prisoners overnight. The Japanese flag rose over colonial towers as the world gasped. Churchill would call it the greatest disaster in British military history. To the west, Burma fell next. Japanese soldiers pushed through jungles and monsoon rains, cutting supply lines to China. The Allied troops, exhausted, starving, outmaneuvered, retreated across mountains, leaving behind equipment, wounded, and the dead. Everywhere, it seemed the rising sun cast its light unchallenged. The empire stretched from the Indian Ocean to the mid-Pacific, from the Aleutians to Australia's doorstep. Japan had achieved in 6 months what it had dreamed of for decades: control of Asia's vast resources, oil, rubber, tin, and rice, all under the banner of the emperor. Tokyo celebrated once again. Newspapers hailed the new age of Japanese dominance. Propaganda films showed triumphant soldiers, crowds bowing before banners of victory. But amid the triumph, Admiral Yamamoto remained silent. He knew what few others in Tokyo yet understood, that the tide would not stay high forever. Back in America, the fury deepened. The photographs from Bataan, the headlines from Singapore, the whispers of massacre and surrender, all of it hardened the nation's heart. What began as grief after Pearl Harbor had become something else, a vow. Roosevelt's words echoed through every factory, every training camp. We will make them pay, and pay dearly. Across the United States, war production doubled, then tripled. Planes, ships, and ammunition rolled out by the hour. Young men flooded into recruiting offices, determined to take the fight back across the ocean. Women built bombers, farmers grew for the front, and scientists raced to perfect new weapons. The Pacific burned, not just with the fire of invasion, but with the spark of vengeance. The Allies reeled, yes, but they were not broken. For every city lost, 1,000 new engines of war were born. For every soldier fallen, another vowed to rise in his place. The Empire of Japan stood at its zenith in the spring of 1942, vast, proud, and unstoppable. But beneath the glory, the foundations were already cracking. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the sleeping giant Yamamoto had warned about was stirring, building its strength in silence. Soon, the Pacific would burn again. But this time, the flames would begin to turn. They spoke of that morning as if it had never truly ended, as if, even decades later, the sound of the bombs still echoed somewhere deep inside them. The survivors of Pearl Harbor carried the day not just in their memories, but in their bones. Each story was a fragment of fire, raw, human, and eternal. One sailor, barely 19 at the time, remembered waking to the sound of aircraft engines, not the steady hum of American planes, but a rising roar that shook the barracks windows. He ran barefoot across the deck of the USS Arizona, still pulling on his uniform when the first bomb struck. The sky turned black, he said softly in an interview years later. I didn't hear the explosion, I felt it. A nurse from the Pearl Harbor Naval Hospital recalled how she and her colleagues worked through clouds of smoke and chaos. There wasn't time to be afraid, she said. Men came and burned, missing limbs, their eyes full of oil. We just did what we could, tore sheets into bandages, whispered to them that help was coming. She paused before adding, almost in a whisper, some of them were still calling for their mothers. From the harbor, others saw hell itself. Oil burned on the water, spreading in slicks of flame that trapped sailors who'd jumped to escape the explosions. One survivor described men trying to swim through fire, their uniforms and skin melting as they struggled toward shore. On the beaches, civilians dragged the wounded from the surf, their hands shaking as they reached for strangers they would never know again. In Honolulu, families watched from rooftops, believing the world was ending. A teacher recalled hiding her students under desks as the sky rained metal. We thought they'd come for us next, she said. We didn't even know who they were yet. There were letters, too, written that morning, still resting in drawers when the mail never came. A young ensign had written to his fiancée. It's another quiet Sunday. You wouldn't believe how calm it is here. Maybe when I get back, we'll go to the beach, a peaceful one. That letter was found weeks later, water-stained, the paper scorched at the edges. Decades later, when historians and journalists recorded their testimonies, the survivors' voices still trembled. Some could not finish their sentences. Others had told the story so many times, it came out in short, practiced fragments, like battle drills of memory. One sailor's voice cracked when he spoke of the moment he realized his shipmates were gone. I dove down into the Arizona, trying to find them. It was dark, and the water was thick with oil. I could see their faces, not moving. I came up, and the air was on fire. They remembered the courage too, the moments of impossible grace amid terror. Men carrying wounded shipmates through flames. Chaplains giving last rites under fire. A cook who grabbed a machine gun and defended his ship long after the officers had fallen. For many, the hardest part wasn't that day, it was the years after. The guilt of survival. The nightmares that came with every siren, every thunderclap. They built lives, raised families, went to work, but in the quiet moments, the war returned. At reunions in Hawaii decades later, old men stood by the harbor's edge in white caps and medals. They spoke softly to one another, sometimes not at all. The sound of the water lapping against the memorial seemed to answer them. One survivor touched the marble wall of the USS Arizona Memorial, tracing a name he once knew. He smiled faintly through tears and said, "We were just kids. We never thought history would remember us. We were just trying to stay alive." And that is how they will be remembered. Not as soldiers of myth, but as human beings who lived through the day the world caught fire. And somehow, found the strength to keep breathing through the smoke. The shock had passed. The ashes still smoldered, the ships still rested beneath the harbor, but something new was taking shape, not grief this time, but resolve. In the days after Pearl Harbor, America's leaders faced the grim reality of their losses and the enormity of the task ahead. The Pacific Fleet, once the pride of the Navy, was crippled. Battleships lay in ruins, aircraft destroyed, airfields burned. But the heart of the fleet, the aircraft carriers, had been away at sea. That small stroke of fate would become the foundation for everything to come. In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt convened his War Council in the Oval Office, the air thick with tension. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "we have been attacked in our sleep. We will not sleep again until it is avenged." The time for speeches was over. The machinery of war was already turning. In Hawaii, a calm, gray-eyed officer stepped off a transport plane onto the scorched runway of Ford Island. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, newly appointed commander of the Pacific Fleet, surveyed the wreckage in silence. Around him, oil fires still burned. The skeletons of ships jutted from the water like broken monuments. An aide asked what he thought. Nimitz looked toward the harbor and said simply, "The Japanese did us a favor, they destroyed everything that was obsolete." That quiet optimism would become his signature. While others saw ruin, Nimitz saw opportunity. The aircraft carrier, once a secondary vessel, would now lead the Navy into a new kind of war. Back in Washington, Roosevelt and his generals laid out the first blueprint for counterattack. America's vast industry was shifting gears at breathtaking speed, car factories building tanks, typewriter plants stamping bullet casings, shipyards working day and night to birth new fleets. But before the slow grind of industrial might could turn the tide, morale needed a spark, something symbolic, something to prove that Japan could be struck back. That spark came from an unorthodox idea by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, an aviator and engineer known for boldness that bordered on reckless. His plan: launch Army bombers from an aircraft carrier, strike Tokyo itself, and remind Japan that the war had only just begun. It was an operation many called impossible, until Doolittle and his men volunteered anyway. Meanwhile, Nimitz began rebuilding what remained of the fleet, forming task forces around the surviving carriers Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga. He reorganized command structures, strengthened supply lines, and drilled his men with relentless precision. Every plane that could still fly, flew. Every sailor who could fight, trained. Across the Pacific, Japanese forces were still advancing, seizing Guam, Wake Island, and the Philippines, but for the first time since the attack, resistance was beginning to form. American submarines prowled the seas. Intelligence networks stirred. The sleeping giant was now awake, and it was learning fast. In the War Department, generals studied Japan's tactics, the coordination of naval air power, the precision of carrier strikes, and began adapting. The next battles would not be fought by battleships, but by air wings and logistics, by codebreakers and long-range strategy. As Roosevelt signed new orders authorizing full mobilization, he paused for a moment. Behind him, a map of the Pacific stretched from San Francisco to the coast of Asia, vast, blue, and filled with uncertainty. But on that map, small pins were beginning to move again, not backward this time, but forward. By the first months of 1942, a sense of purpose had replaced paralysis. Shipyards along the coasts thundered. Young men stood in lines outside recruiting offices. And on an airfield in California, Doolittle's bombers began secret training for a mission that would carry the war straight back to Japan's doorstep. In Pearl Harbor, Nimitz stood on the deck of a repaired destroyer and watched the sun rise over the Pacific. The fires of December 7th had scorched the fleet, but they had also tempered the steel of a nation. The tide, though distant, was beginning to turn, not yet in the oceans, but in the hearts of those who would fight upon them. Even after the flames died, Pearl Harbor never truly went quiet. The sea itself seemed to remember. In the weeks and months after the attack, divers and salvage crews descended into the dark, oil-slicked waters of the harbor. They worked in silence, cutting through twisted steel, searching for the living, recovering the dead. The water was cold and thick with fuel, it clung to everything, black and heavy, like grief made visible. They raised what they could. Battleships were refloated, repaired, or towed away. The Nevada, scarred and scorched, would sail again. The West Virginia, nearly lost, would return to the fight before the war was over. Piece by piece, the fleet clawed its way back to life. But not all could be saved. Beneath the harbor, resting in the mud, lay the USS Arizona, a ship so violently destroyed that her heart had simply stopped beating. More than 1,100 men remained inside her, sealed forever in steel and shadow. For the Navy, she was declared what no ship had ever been before, a tomb. The Arizona's mast still jutted from the water for years, a silent sentinel above the wreck. Sailors passing through the harbor would salute as they went by, hats in hand, eyes averted. The harbor was no longer just a base, it had become a cemetery. Families came, too. Mothers, widows, and children stood on the docks, looking out at the calm, blue water that hid so much pain. Some tossed flowers into the tide. Others said nothing at all. The ocean would not give them back their sons. And then there was the oil. It still seeps from the Arizona's shattered hull even today, slow, black ribbons rising through the water, shimmering in the sun. The sailors call them the black tears. Each drop, they say, is another soul the sea refuses to forget. As years passed, time softened the wreckage but not the memory. The Navy preserved what it could. Divers mapped the site, built scaffolding, and, eventually, raised small relics from below, a bell, a piece of railing, a single anchor. But the ship itself remained untouched. To disturb it felt like sacrilege. In 1962, over 20 years after the attack, the USS Arizona Memorial was built, a white bridge spanning the ship's sunken remains. Its design was simple, pure, and haunting. The floor sloped gently downward in the center, a reminder of collapse, then rose again toward light, symbolizing renewal. Beneath the floor, through clear blue water, visitors could see the rusting hull and the slow drift of oil. The names of the dead are carved in marble on the wall at the memorial's far end, a roll call that never ends. Some of the men who survived the attack have chosen to return there in death, their ashes placed by divers inside the ship beside their shipmates. Every December 7th, As dawn breaks over Oahu, the Navy stands at attention. Trumpets play taps. Ships across the harbor lower their flags to half-mast. The air carries both silence and song, grief and gratitude intertwined. The tourists who visit now often whisper, moved not by spectacle but by stillness. The water glimmers, the sunlight dances, but beneath that beauty lies the weight of history. The harbor, once a place of war, became something sacred, not a monument to destruction, but to endurance. It is where the dead rest, and where the living remember. The USS Arizona still bleeds its black tears into the sea, one drop every few seconds, as if time itself refuses to let go. And in that quiet, eternal rhythm, the voices of the lost still echo, reminding all who pass above them that peace, like freedom, is never free. America did not awaken quietly. It rose with a roar of engines, steel, and purpose. In the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, the country that had once prided itself on peace turned its full might toward war. The grief of December 7th hardened into resolve, and resolve became production. Across the nation, factories that once built cars, refrigerators, and radios began to forge the weapons of a new world. Assembly lines multiplied like veins of iron. At Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan, workers built a B-24 bomber every hour, wings spreading from conveyor belts that once made Model Ts. In California, Kaiser shipyards launched Liberty ships faster than any navy in history, sometimes in less than a week. The skyline of America shifted, smokestacks became spires of defiance. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had promised that the United States would become the arsenal of democracy. What began as a metaphor became a machine. The war effort was not limited to soldiers, it was sustained by welders, riveters, machinists, and dreamers. Women flooded into the workforce, replacing the men who had gone to war. They took their places at lathes and furnaces, their hair tied back under scarves, their hands blackened by steel dust. They built planes, tanks, and bullets by the millions. The image of Rosie the Riveter, sleeves rolled, gaze unflinching, fist raised, became a symbol of a nation that refused to break. Children collected scrap metal in schoolyards. Housewives saved cooking grease for explosives. Farmers sent crops to feed armies across 2 oceans. Every town became part of the front line, every factory a fortress. By 1943, American production outstripped that of all the Axis powers combined. Tank factories thundered in Detroit. Aircraft plants stretched for miles in Seattle, Long Beach, and Dallas. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, the P-51 Mustang, the Sherman tank, and the Liberty ship, each became icons of a war that was now fought with bolts as well as bullets. It wasn't just machines being built. It was confidence. The same country that had been caught unprepared now understood the power of unity. Propaganda posters lined factory walls. Do the job he left behind. Loose lips sink ships. Victory is in your hands. Hollywood joined the effort. Stars like James Stewart, Clark Gable, and Carole Lombard raised war bonds or served in uniform. Songs filled the radio, Remember Pearl Harbor, Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy, Praise the Lord and Pass the Ammunition. The war had become part of daily life, woven into every heartbeat of the home front. For many Americans, Pearl Harbor had been more than a military loss, it had been a shattering of faith. Now, through work and unity, that faith was being rebuilt in metal and sweat. In every newly forged rivet and freshly welded hole was the memory of that December morning, the promise that such a blow would never fall again unanswered. Factories became cathedrals of purpose. Workers prayed not with words, but with hammers. Every plane that rolled out of the hangar carried more than bombs, it carried vengeance, hope, and the weight of every life lost in the harbor. When Roosevelt spoke again to the nation in 1942, his tone had changed. There was no despair, only certainty. "We have been attacked. We will defend ourselves. We will win." And win they would, not through luck or miracles, but through relentless creation. By the war's end, America had produced nearly 300,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks, and over 8,000 ships. It had fed, armed, and supplied not only itself, but its allies across the world. The sleeping giant that Yamamoto had feared was no longer asleep. Its footsteps thundered from the factories of Detroit to the waves of the Pacific. And in every spark, every hammer strike, every woman's steady hands guiding molten steel, there was one message beating like a drum beneath it all. Remember Pearl Harbor. In April 1942, just 4 months after Pearl Harbor, the impossible happened. For the first time in its history, Japan felt the sky above it tremble with foreign thunder. From the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Hornet, 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers sat poised in the cold dawn air. Their olive-drab wings were streaked with salt spray, their bellies heavy with fuel and bombs. The men who flew them knew the odds. They were embarking on a mission that was, by all logic, suicidal. Their leader, Lieutenant Colonel James "Jimmy" Doolittle, stood on the flight deck before takeoff, calm but focused. A scientist, racer, and daredevil all in one, Doolittle had volunteered for what even he called a one-way trip. His task was simple in words but impossible in practice. Launch medium bombers from a carrier, something never done before, fly over 650 miles to Tokyo, bomb the Japanese homeland, and somehow make it to friendly territory in China. It was revenge, but it was also a message. After the humiliation of Pearl Harbor, America would not wait years to strike back. The morning was gray and rough. High waves slapped the carrier's bow as the fleet sailed deep into enemy waters. They were still 700 miles from Japan when a Japanese patrol vessel spotted them. It was destroyed by gunfire, but the alarm had been raised. Doolittle and his men had no choice, they would launch early. The mission, already near impossible, now became a gamble with fate. One by one, the B-25s began to roll down the deck. There was no margin for error. The Hornet's flight deck was barely long enough. If the planes didn't lift off in time, they'd plunge into the sea. Sailors lined the deck, holding their breath as each bomber roared past them into the storm. The last plane disappeared into the mist, leaving only the echo of engines and the hope that some would make it home. Hours later, Japan heard the sound of war it had never expected. Air raid sirens screamed over Tokyo, Nagoya, Kobe, and Yokohama. The first bombs fell on military factories, oil depots, and docks, but their true target was psychological. For years, Japan had believed its home islands untouchable, protected by distance and divine favor. Now, the illusion was gone. Civilians ran for cover as smoke rose over the city. Emperor Hirohito was rushed to safety. Panic rippled through the nation, not because of the physical damage, which was minor, but because the unthinkable had happened. The war had come home. Meanwhile, Doolittle's raiders, having completed their mission, faced a desperate journey toward China. They had flown farther than expected, running out of fuel over the mountains and coastline. One by one, the planes crash-landed or were abandoned midair. Some crews were rescued by Chinese villagers, others were captured by the Japanese. Of the 80 men who took part in the raid, 3 were killed in action, 8 captured, and 4 executed after brutal interrogation. The rest, battered and exhausted, eventually made it back to friendly lines. When Doolittle finally returned to the United States, he believed he had failed. "I thought we'd done little physical damage," he said later. "I expected to be court-martialed." Instead, he was greeted as a hero. The raid had electrified American morale and shattered Japan's confidence. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, America was no longer merely reacting, it was fighting back. Across the nation, newspaper headlines blazed. Tokyo bombed. U.S. planes strike Japan. The words carried more power than any weapon. In Japan, the shock was just as profound. The attack humiliated the military high command. In rage and embarrassment, Japan retaliated savagely, massacring thousands of Chinese civilians suspected of aiding the Americans. But strategically, it led Tokyo to a fatal mistake, the decision to expand and secure its defensive perimeter in the Pacific. That decision would lead directly to Midway, where Japan's carriers, the same that had struck Pearl Harbor, would sail into the trap that changed the course of the war. The Doolittle raid was small, fleeting, and costly. But it proved something far greater than its destruction, that America could strike back from the ashes, and that the rising sun could, indeed, be reached. For those who watched the newsreels in darkened theaters across the U.S., it was more than just revenge. It was hope, roaring through the skies on 16 silver wings. 6 months after the black morning of Pearl Harbor, the ocean itself seemed to shift. The rising sun, which had burned so bright across the Pacific, was about to meet the dawn of its undoing. The stage was set near a small, lonely speck of coral called Midway Atoll, halfway between Asia and America, a dot on the map that would become the turning point of the Pacific War. After the Doolittle raid's humiliation, Japan had a new plan: lure what remained of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a trap, destroy it completely, and force America to the negotiating table. It was to be a final blow, a mirror of Pearl Harbor, this time in open water. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the December attack, believed the plan foolproof. His fleet was vast: 4 frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, escorted by battleships and cruisers. Each carried pilots who had triumphed at Pearl Harbor, men hardened and proud. They believed the Americans broken. They believed the ocean still belonged to them. But what they didn't know was that their every move was being watched, not by spies, but by the quiet hum of radio waves and the minds of American codebreakers. At Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rockefeller and his team of cryptanalysts had done the impossible. They had broken Japan's JN-25 naval code. Through fragments of intercepted messages, one word kept reappearing: AF. Rockefeller was certain it meant Midway. To confirm it, his team tricked the Japanese into reporting that Midway's water purification system has failed. Hours later, Tokyo's encrypted message confirmed, AF is short on water. The trap was set. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, calm as ever, placed his trust in intelligence rather than numbers. He sent 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, to lie in wait north of Midway. The hunters had become the hunted. At dawn on June 4, 1942, Japanese bombers struck Midway's airfield, confident the American fleet was nowhere near. But above the clouds, American scout planes had already found them. From the decks of the U.S. carriers, waves of dive bombers launched into the morning sky. They climbed into cold blue air, facing exhaustion, confusion, and the endless horizon, until, by chance and skill, they found their enemy. The battle turned in the space of 5 minutes. At 10:22 a.m., a squadron of USSBD Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise in Yorktown appeared above the Japanese carriers just as their decks were crowded with refueling planes and loaded bombs. The Americans dove almost vertically, screaming toward the sea, bombs whistling through smoke and chaos. In moments, the carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu erupted in sheets of flame. Explosions tore through hangars. Fuel lines ignited. Pilots still in their cockpits were consumed in fire. Within hours, 3 of Japan's proudest ships, veterans of Pearl Harbor, were gone. Only Hiryu remained. Her plane struck back fiercely, crippling the Yorktown, which later sank. But by afternoon, she too was found and destroyed, her decks blazing as the sun set over the Pacific. By nightfall, the waters near Midway were littered with burning oil, twisted metal, and the shattered dreams of an empire. For Japanese carriers, the same four that had attacked Pearl Harbor, now lay beneath the waves. It was more than a naval victory. It was the breaking of the spell. For the first time in the war, Japan had been decisively beaten. Its best pilots gone, its fleet crippled, its myth of invincibility drowned in its own wake. Yamamoto, hearing the news from his flagship, said nothing for a long time. Then quietly, he murmured, "The battle has turned against us." In Pearl Harbor, when the first reports arrived, Admiral Nimitz stood silently by a radio. Someone whispered, "Sir, it looks like we've won." He nodded once and said simply, "They struck first at Pearl. We've struck back at Midway." Across America, news of the victory swept like wine through factory floors and army camps. The same workers who had wept 6 months earlier now cheered. The same families who had hung gold stars in their windows now whispered a new word: revenge. Midway did more than avenge Pearl Harbor, it shifted the course of the entire war. From that moment on, Japan would never again seize the initiative. The Pacific, once a Japanese ocean, now began to flow in the other direction. The tide had turned, not with fury, but with precision, courage, and the quiet brilliance of those who had listened to the enemy's whispers and turned them into victory. And in that turning, the echoes of Pearl Harbor found their answer. The attack on Pearl Harbor did more than ignite a war, it reforged a nation. Before December 7, 1941, America had been divided, isolationists against interventionists, the weary of the Great Depression against the uncertain promise of global duty. But when the smoke rose over Oahu, every argument dissolved in the same instant. The country that had slept in peace awoke with purpose, and from that purpose came unity unlike anything it had ever known. Within days, war reshaped American life in ways no one could have imagined. The economy, still recovering from the Depression, roared into motion as factories turned from peacetime goods to weapons of war. Detroit, once the Motor City, became the arsenal of democracy. Automobiles gave way to tanks, and the hum of engines became the heartbeat of the home front. Every American, soldier or civilian, became part of the fight. Rationing began, sugar, rubber, fuel, coffee, meat, all carefully measured to feed the war effort. Posters urged citizens to save every scrap, every drop, every ounce. Do with less, so they'll have enough. Families planted victory gardens in backyards and empty lots, their vegetables destined for both kitchen tables and soldiers' mess kits. War bonds became a patriotic ritual. Movie stars and singers crisscrossed the country, selling hope printed on paper. Frank Sinatra, Carole Lombard, and Bing Crosby stood before roaring crowds, urging Americans to buy bonds and believe in victory. Hollywood itself became part of the front line. On the silver screen, the war was everywhere. Films like Mrs. Miniver, Casablanca, and Wake Island stirred courage and defiance. Cartoon characters joined the cause, Mickey Mouse and Bugs Bunny fought fascists with laughter. In the theaters, newsreels flickered with images from the front, grainy and distant but powerful enough to bind a nation's heart. Music filled the airwaves, carrying strength through song. Big band horns blared patriotic marches. Ballads like Praise the Lord and Pass the Ammunition and Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy became anthems of hope. On the radio, President Roosevelt's fireside chats comforted millions, his calm voice turning fear into resolve. We are fighting not only to defend our nation, but to defend freedom itself. For many, it felt as though the entire country had become one great army, factories as barracks, kitchens as supply lines, neighborhoods as platoons. And yet, beneath this unity, there were shadows. In the fever of war, fear found its victims. In February 1942, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the internment of Japanese Americans. Over 120,000 men, women, and children, most of them U.S. citizens, were uprooted from their homes and sent to camps behind barbed wire. Their loyalty questioned, their dignity stripped, they endured the irony of suffering for the very nation they still believed in. Many of their sons volunteered to fight regardless, forming the legendary 442nd Regimental Combat Team, one of the most decorated units in U.S. history. Their motto, "Go for broke," became an answer to prejudice, written in courage rather than complaint. Across the rest of the country, the war erased boundaries that had once seemed immovable. Women stepped into factories, offices, and uniformed service, not just Rosies, but pilots in the WASP program, nurses in the Pacific, engineers, and scientists. African Americans, too, demanded and earned their place in the fight. The Tuskegee Airmen took to the skies, disproving every racist lie ever spoken against them. Double victory, victory abroad and at home, became their battle cry. In every sense, America was becoming something larger than it had ever been, imperfect, conflicted, but united by necessity and shared destiny. War changed the rhythm of life itself. Cities went dark under blackout curtains. Young couples married on leave, their vows short and urgent. Families crowded around radios for news of battles far across the world, Midway, Guadalcanal, North Africa, cheering, praying, waiting. What Pearl Harbor began, in fire, smoke, and chaos, transformed into a movement of will and purpose. It wasn't just a war for survival, it became a test of character. The nation had to prove it could be both powerful and just, both fierce and free. By the time 1943 arrived, the country that once hesitated to look beyond its shores had become a global force, its industry unmatched, its people united in sacrifice. From that December morning of infamy had risen something extraordinary, not merely an army, but a shared belief that freedom, once endangered, was worth every ounce of effort, every drop of sweat, every life laid down to defend it. America had not only awakened, it had become indivisible, tempered by loss, and defined by the unbreakable will to endure. After the smoke of Pearl Harbor cleared, fear settled like a second kind of ash, not from bombs, but from suspicion. In the name of safety, the country that had just declared a war for freedom began to imprison its own citizens. The attack on December 7, 1941, had torn open more than ships, it had torn open trust. Across the West Coast, rumors spread faster than reason. Newspapers printed whispers of Japanese-American fifth columnists, spies in the fields, saboteurs among the fishermen. There was no proof, only panic. In February 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, granting the U.S. military authority to remove anyone from designated military zones. The order never mentioned race by name, but its intent was unmistakable. Within weeks, over 120,000 Japanese Americans, two-thirds of them born in the United States, were forced to leave their homes. The scenes that followed were heartbreak disguised as patriotism. Families sold their homes for a fraction of their worth. Farmers abandoned fields still heavy with crops. Shopkeepers locked their doors for the last time, uncertain if they would ever return. They were allowed to bring only what they could carry, suitcases packed not with belongings, but with the remnants of lives suddenly erased. Trains carried them eastward, guarded by armed soldiers. Children pressed their faces to the windows, watching the only world they knew fade into distance. Their destinations were not cities, but camps, Manzanar, Heart Mountain, Tule Lake, Topaz, and others scattered across desolate lands. Behind barbed wire, under watchtowers, they built new worlds out of dust. Barracks of tar paper and wood became makeshift homes. Schools, gardens, and churches rose in the shadow of confinement. They called themselves the Nisei, the second generation, Americans by birth, prisoners by policy. The government called the camps relocation centers. But the internees knew what they really were, prisons. Inside, they pledged allegiance to the same flag that flew above the gates. And still, they waited for America to remember its own promises. Some refused to let bitterness define them. Young men of Japanese descent volunteered to fight for the very country that had caged their families. They formed the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, an all-Japanese-American unit that would go on to become one of the most decorated in U.S. military history. In Italy and France, they fought with unmatched courage. The 442nd rescued a trapped battalion of Texans in the Vosges Mountains, a suicidal mission that cost hundreds of Japanese-American lives. Their motto, "Go for broke," became a challenge to prejudice itself, proof that loyalty does not depend on heritage, but on heart. Back home, life in the camps went on. Letters from sons fighting overseas reached parents behind fences. The irony was unbearable, a family divided by loyalty to the same flag. Mothers prayed not only for victory, but for understanding. The years passed slowly in confinement. Children grew up knowing only fences and dust. Yet, even in captivity, there was dignity. Baseball games were played, newspapers printed, weddings held beneath the open sky. The human spirit, though wounded, refused to die. When the war ended, the gates opened, but the world outside was changed, and not always welcoming. Many returned to find their homes gone, their businesses sold, their neighbors distant. They rebuilt quietly, carrying scars that were invisible but permanent. For decades, America avoided speaking of what it had done. The story of the camps lived in family whispers, in letters never mailed, in the silence between generations. But history, like conscience, cannot stay buried forever. In 1988, more than 40 years later, the U.S. government formally apologized. President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, declaring the internment a grave injustice born of race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. Survivors received a letter and a symbolic check, not as payment, but as acknowledgement. For some, it was too late. For others, it was enough to finally exhale. The story of the Japanese internment remains one of America's deepest contradictions, a nation that fought tyranny abroad while surrendering to fear at home. It is a reminder that liberty, when tested by fear, is never guaranteed. It must be protected, even from ourselves. And among the barbed wire ghosts of Manzanar and Heart Mountain, the wind still carries a quiet vow, born of pain and endurance. The echo of Pearl Harbor did not stop at the shores of Hawaii. It rolled across oceans, crossed continents, and reshaped the entire world. For 24 hours after the attack, the planet seemed to hold its breath. The news traveled by radio and telegram, from Washington to London, from Moscow to Cairo, from Tokyo to Berlin. Everywhere, the same disbelief: the United States, the great neutral giant, had been struck without warning. In London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill was dining with his aides when the phone rang. The voice on the other end said simply, "Japan has attacked the United States." Churchill froze, then turned to his companions with a strange expression, part sorrow, part relief. He later wrote, being saturated and satiated with emotion and sensation, "I went to bed and slept the sleep of the saved and the thankful." For Churchill knew what the attack meant: the United States was now in the war, and the free world was no longer alone. In Moscow, the Soviet Union was reeling under Hitler's invasion. When news of Pearl Harbor reached Joseph Stalin, he reportedly smiled for the first time in months. the burden of fighting the Nazis would now be shared by a new, powerful ally across the ocean. Across the British Empire, in Canada, Australia, India, and the African colonies, the reaction was immediate. Flags were lowered in mourning, then raised in defiance. Editorials called it the strike that united civilization. The sleeping giant had awakened, and its roar would be felt from Normandy to the Pacific. In Tokyo, the reaction was jubilation. Crowds filled the streets waving flags and singing national anthems. Newspapers declared a glorious victory. Radio broadcasts announced that Japan had humiliated America and secured the Pacific. But behind the smiles, some in the Japanese government, including Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself, were silent. He knew the attack was not the end of a war, but the beginning of one Japan could not win. In private, he told his staff, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." That resolve became evident within days. On December 8, 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress, his voice calm but unyielding. His words, "a date which will live in infamy," traveled across the world, carried by shortwave radio to millions. Within hours, America declared war on Japan. 3 days later, in Berlin, Adolf Hitler made a fatal choice. In a fit of arrogance and solidarity with his Axis ally, he declared war on the United States, even though Japan had not informed him of its plans. Standing before the Reichstag, Hitler thundered that Germany and Italy would now fight alongside Japan to destroy Anglo-American capitalism once and for all. But in truth, he had just doomed his own empire. With that declaration, the conflict that had begun in Europe and Asia merged into a single, global inferno. The war was no longer a series of regional struggles, it was now World War II, a confrontation of ideologies, empires, and survival itself. The Allies, the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and China, stood together against the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan. It was not a clean divide between good and evil, but it was absolute in scale, nations mobilizing every citizen, every resource, every prayer. Factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh began producing tanks and planes not only for America but for Britain and Russia. Convoys braved U-boat-infested waters to deliver supplies to the Eastern Front. In the Pacific, the United States prepared to push back against Japan's empire, island by island, mile by mile. For millions across occupied Europe and Asia, the news of America's entry brought a flicker of hope. French resistance fighters heard Roosevelt's speech over crackling radios in hidden basements. Prisoners in Asia whispered that salvation might yet come from across the sea. The world's geography had not changed, but its balance had. Pearl Harbor had been a strike meant to cripple, instead, it united half the planet against tyranny. What began as a morning of destruction became the spark that fused the Allied nations into a single cause. Factories, armies, and hearts across the free world now beat to one rhythm. The battle lines stretched from the snows of Russia to the deserts of North Africa, from the jungles of Burma to the coral atolls of the Pacific. The echo that began in the calm waters of Pearl Harbor became a storm that would sweep across the globe. And though it would take years and millions of lives, that echo, born of infamy and vengeance, would ultimately reshape the destiny of the world. In the quiet of the Pacific night, the architect of Pearl Harbor sat alone in his cabin, the hum of engines faint beneath his feet. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy, read the reports of victory that his officers had placed before him. The tone of the dispatches was triumphant: ships sunk, planes destroyed, morale shattered. It was everything he had planned for, everything his nation had wanted. And yet, as he read, Yamamoto felt no triumph, only an ache that refused to fade. He had studied in America once, at Harvard. He had traveled the country, seen its vastness, its energy, its spirit. He had attended baseball games, walked the streets of New York, ridden trains that never seemed to end. He understood what many of his fellow officers did not, that America's strength was not in its fleets or factories alone, but in its people. He had warned Japan's military council for years that war with the United States would be long and unwinnable. In the first 6 months, he had said, "I will run wild. I will win victory after victory. But after that, I have no expectation of success." Now, with the ink still drying on his battle reports, the truth of his own prophecy began to haunt him. The crew of his flagship, Akagi, celebrated on the decks above, songs, laughter, toasts to the emperor. They believed they had secured Japan's future. But below, Yamamoto sat motionless, staring at a map of the Pacific. His hand rested near Hawaii, tracing the arc from Tokyo to Pearl Harbor to the American mainland. He whispered, not for anyone to hear, "I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Outside, the sea was calm, too calm. The stars shimmered above the endless horizon, the same stars under which the U.S. Pacific Fleet now lay in ruin. Yet in those same waters, unseen and patient, America's vengeance was already stirring. Yamamoto was a man divided, a warrior bound by duty, a strategist chained to foresight. He had carried out the emperor's will flawlessly, yet he felt the weight of something irreversible. The Japanese people believed the gods had guided their victory. Yamamoto knew it was human error, chance, and daring that had granted them this fleeting success. As weeks turned into months, his warnings proved prophetic. Each new victory, in the Philippines, in Singapore, in Burma, seemed hollow to him. Every conquered island stretched Japan's supply lines thinner. Every battle won was one step closer to exhaustion. He saw it in the faces of his men, confidence turning to arrogance, humility replaced by pride. The rising sun burned brightly, but even the brightest flame burns fastest. In private, Yamamoto continued to write letters home to his family. In one, he confessed, "Should I fall in battle, I ask only that you remember I did my duty. My greatest wish is peace, though I no longer believe I will see it." By 1943, the tide had shifted. The Doolittle raid had shaken Japan's pride, and Midway had shattered its carriers. The fleet he had once commanded with such precision was now diminished, its best pilots gone, its strength ebbing with every encounter. Still, Yamamoto remained loyal to the end. He took to the skies in April of that year to visit his troops in the Solomon Islands, to remind them that the emperor still believed in victory. But the Americans, who had once underestimated him, were now reading his codes, just as he had once read theirs. They knew his flight plan. They knew his route. Over Bougainville, US P-38 fighters intercepted his aircraft. The admiral's plane was torn apart in seconds, crashing into the jungle below. When they found him, he was still seated, sword at his side, his cap in his lap, as if asleep. In Tokyo, his death was mourned as heroic, the fall of a national icon. Yet for those who truly knew him, it was something more complex, the passing of a man who had seen too clearly the cost of his own genius. Yamamoto had been right. Japan's empire, once radiant, began to shrink, crushed beneath the weight of industrial giants and endless resolve. And somewhere, beneath the vast Pacific sky he had once commanded, the waves carried his final echo, a whisper both prophetic and tragic. When the survivors returned to Pearl Harbor, the island was unrecognizable. The lush paradise they had once known, the blue water, the hum of aircraft, the easy laughter on the decks, had turned into a graveyard of steel and silence. They stepped off the transports months after the attack, still carrying the smell of oil and smoke in their uniforms, still hearing the echoes of the sirens that had shattered their sleep. The harbor that greeted them was calm now, deceptively calm, its surface glittering under the same tropical sun that had once illuminated hell. The USS Arizona lay half-submerged, her shattered superstructure jutting from the water like broken bones. Oklahoma was still capsized, her belly rusted and torn. Other ships, Nevada, California, West Virginia, rested awkwardly on the harbor floor, silent monuments to the chaos that had claimed them. Men who had fought for their lives that morning now stood on the docks, their reflections wavering in the water where their shipmates still slept below. They said little. There were no words left big enough to hold what they felt. Some touched the wrecks gently, as though afraid to wake the dead. Others removed their caps and bowed their heads in silence. Divers and salvage crews worked nearby, the clang of tools echoing through the stillness. Every piece of recovered steel, every body lifted from the depths, was treated with reverence. The harbor was both a workplace and a shrine. The smell of oil still hung heavy in the air, a dark reminder of the destruction. The men called it the tears of the Arizona. It seeped from the wreck in a slow, steady trickle, black ribbons rising through the blue, spreading across the surface in rainbows of grief. It seemed endless, as though the ship itself refused to stop mourning. On the shores, makeshift memorials had begun to appear, crosses of driftwood, flowers gathered by local children, small flags fluttering in the warm wind. Chaplains held services where sailors stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces hard and their eyes hollow. The prayers were short and trembling, carried away by the waves. One Marine sergeant, who had lost his entire gun crew on the Oklahoma, spoke quietly during a ceremony. "We came back to find them, but they never left. They're still here. They always will be." For those who had survived, the harbor no longer felt like a place of duty, it was sacred ground. Every ripple in the water seemed to whisper the names of the fallen. Every breeze carried the ghosts of that morning's chaos, the drone of engines, the crash of bombs, the cries for help swallowed by fire. In Honolulu, the city was rebuilding, its people changed but unbroken. Civilians welcomed the sailors and Marines like brothers, feeding them, listening to their stories, helping them heal in ways no doctor could. Yet, at night, many of the men lay awake, the roar of the attack replaying behind their closed eyes. Some would return home after the war, start families, grow old. Others would stay, unable to leave the place where so many of their brothers had fallen. Many came back every year on December 7th, standing at the harbor's edge in silence as the Navy raised its flags to half-mast. In 1942, they built the first temporary memorial, a simple wooden platform over the remains of the Arizona. There were no speeches, no politicians, just the survivors, their uniforms pressed, their hearts heavy. They tossed flowers into the sea, watching them drift across the wreck. They did not see ghosts. They felt them. In the salt, in the steel, in the sunlight glinting off the water. Even decades later, when time had softened memory and rebuilt the harbor into a bustling naval base again, those who had been there could never see Pearl Harbor as ordinary. For them, it would always be two places at once, the paradise they once loved, and the inferno they barely escaped. To this day, visitors who stand on the white deck of the USS Arizona Memorial often speak of a strange stillness there, a quiet that feels alive. Beneath them, the ship sleeps in peace, yet the faint shimmer of oil still rises to the surface, as if the past itself continues to breathe. For the men who returned, and for those who never left, the harbor remains both wound and monument, a place where the ocean holds memory, and every wave still carries the echo of that morning when the world changed forever. History rarely whispers its lessons, it shouts them in fire. Pearl Harbor was one of those shouts, echoing across generations. In the years that followed the attack, the world began to understand that the destruction of December 7, 1941, had been more than a military failure, it was a warning written in smoke and steel. The lessons carved from that morning would go on to shape nations, doctrines, and the very way modern warfare would be understood. The first lesson was complacency, the deadliest illusion. Before the attack, the United States believed in its distance, in the safety of oceans and the illusion that war belonged to other continents. Pearl Harbor shattered that myth in a single hour. The Japanese fleet had crossed thousands of miles of open ocean, undetected, to strike the most powerful navy in the world at rest. From that day forward, no nation would ever again trust geography to protect it. The world had entered an age where distance meant nothing, where machines could cross oceans, where time zones could no longer contain danger. Every radar screen, every satellite, every coded message used in later wars would trace its lineage back to that failure of imagination. The second lesson was communication, or rather, its absence. Warnings had existed, intercepted messages, strange fleet movements, broken codes. Yet, those fragments of truth were scattered through bureaucracies and lost in translation. The tragedy of Pearl Harbor was not that the signals weren't seen, but that no one connected them in time. From that failure was born a new world of intelligence, agencies, coordination, and the art of reading the silence between the words. The modern era of espionage, signals intelligence, and real-time decision-making was born from the ashes of that harbor. The third lesson was preparation. Pearl Harbor taught that strength on paper means nothing without readiness. Battleships lined up neatly in rows, aircraft parked wing to wing, symbols of order that became perfect targets. It was a visual metaphor for how comfort blinds nations, the belief that routine is safety. After that morning, militaries across the world learned that survival belonged not to the strongest, but to the most vigilant. The final and deepest lesson was unity through tragedy. In trying to cripple America, Japan had done the opposite. It had awakened something far greater than force. The attack bound a divided nation together, transforming anger into action, sorrow into strength. From that unity rose not only victory, but purpose. Pearl Harbor taught that even the most devastating blow can become the forge of renewal. Globally, the event changed how nations viewed war itself. No longer could leaders afford to treat conflict as something distant, fought by armies alone. The modern world understood that wars were fought everywhere, in skies, in codes, in supply chains, in hearts. Intelligence and vigilance became the twin shields of peace. Communication became the weapon that could prevent destruction before it began. Every siren that sounds in warning, every encrypted signal, every satellite orbiting the Earth carries the legacy of Pearl Harbor, the vow that such blindness will not happen again. And yet, history is a patient teacher. Its lessons are often learned, then forgotten, then learned again. The danger of underestimation, of believing it cannot happen to us, remains as present as it was that Sunday morning. For all its horror, Pearl Harbor did something no speech or treaty could have achieved. It reminded humanity that vigilance is not paranoia, and peace is not the absence of danger, it is the product of awareness, courage, and unity. The harbor still glimmers under the Pacific sun, its waters calm, its memorials white against the blue. But beneath that serenity lies the enduring truth. The price of complacency is always paid in lives. And from that day of infamy onward, the world vowed, however imperfectly, to remember. The road to redemption began not in triumph, but in ruin. When the smoke of Pearl Harbor cleared, the United States stood wounded, but not defeated. From those blackened waters rose a nation reborn in purpose. Every sailor, every pilot, every worker in every factory carried the same vow: never again. The attack on December 7, 1941, was the wound that would define the war. But it also became the spark that fueled America's rise from grief to glory. The path would be long and brutal, carved across oceans and jungles, through islands whose names would be written in blood: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, each one a step toward redemption. The first counterstrike came in 1942, on the humid shores of Guadalcanal. There, the newly rebuilt U.S. Navy clashed with Japan's finest. It was the first time American troops went on the offensive in the Pacific, and the cost was immense: disease, exhaustion, and death stalked every foxhole. But when the Marines finally raised their flag over the airstrip, it marked a turning point. The empire that had seemed unstoppable after Pearl Harbor had finally begun to bleed. From there, the island war spread like wildfire. Each battle was a test of endurance, not just of soldiers, but of spirit. On the beaches of Tarawa, Marines charged across open reefs under withering machine gun fire. Many drowned before they even reached land. The survivors fought yard by yard, bunker by bunker, refusing to yield. When the island fell, it was said that America had learned the cost of victory. The campaign moved north through the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, Guam islands that would become the springboards for the bomber fleets that would one day reach Tokyo itself. The fighting there was fierce beyond imagination. Japanese soldiers fought to the last man, and civilians, fed lies of American brutality, leapt from cliffs rather than surrender. The horror only deepened America's resolve. Each mile reclaimed in the Pacific was an echo of that Sunday morning at Pearl Harbor. The sailors who launched their ships into new battles did so with the ghosts of that harbor still beside them. Every shell fired, every plane launched, carried the weight of memory. And then came Iwo Jima. The black sands were hell itself, a volcanic wasteland fortified by tunnels and steel. The battle lasted 36 days. When it ended, 6,800 Americans and over 20,000 Japanese lay dead. But from that island came one image that would define the entire war: 6 Marines raising the flag atop Mount Suribachi. In that photograph, the world saw not conquest, but redemption, the flag that had once been lowered in defeat now lifted again by hands that refused to give in. Pearl Harbor had been the beginning of America's nightmare, but Iwo Jima became its awakening. From there, the path led to Okinawa, the last and bloodiest of all. Entire divisions fell. Civilians perished by the tens of thousands. Yet through that storm of death, the United States could finally see the end: Japan itself, battered, starving, and cornered. The war that had begun with surprise and humiliation would end in fire and surrender. In August 1945, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki brought the Pacific conflict to its terrible conclusion. The same sun that had once risen red over Pearl Harbor now burned white-hot over Japan, forcing the empire that had struck first to finally lay down its arms. When the surrender documents were signed aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, many of the men standing on her decks had been in Hawaii that morning in 1941. They had seen their comrades die in the water and had sworn vengeance. Now, for years later, they watched as Japan's representatives bowed their heads in defeat. For them, Pearl Harbor had come full circle, from smoke to silence, from chaos to peace. But it was not a peace born of hatred. It was a peace earned through sacrifice, through endurance, through the unbreakable belief that the darkness of one morning would not define the future of mankind. In the years that followed, Japan and the United States, once enemies bound by blood, would become allies, their histories intertwined by tragedy and transformation. The war that began with infamy ended with understanding, and the harbor that once symbolized destruction would one day become a monument to peace. The road to redemption was paved with loss, but it led to something enduring, a reminder that even in the ashes of defeat, a nation can rise again. Pearl Harbor was not the end. It was the beginning of a promise kept. A promise that from ruin can come resolve. And from resolve, victory. By 1944, the tide that had once drowned Pearl Harbor began to surge in the other direction. The Pacific, once a Japanese ocean, now belonged to the United States. What had begun as desperation had transformed into dominance. Across those same waters where the rising sun once reigned, American task forces now moved in thunderous formation, carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers stretching to the horizon. The navy that had been broken in the harbor had been reborn, stronger than before, forged from loss into vengeance. Among those ships sailed the USS West Virginia, raised from the mud of Pearl Harbor, repaired, rearmed, and recommissioned. Once sunk under a rain of torpedoes, she now steamed proudly at the head of battle groups, her guns booming in the night. Each shell fired seemed to carry the memory of that December morning, a steel promise fulfilled. The great counteroffensive had begun. At Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, the full weight of America's new power came crashing down upon Japan's shrinking empire. For separate engagements, Samar, Surigao Strait, Cape Engano, Sibuyan Sea, raged across hundreds of miles. The sea burned with oil and fire. The skies filled with planes, Hellcats, Avengers, and dauntless bombers, swooping down on Japanese carriers that had once ruled those same waves. For the first time, the U.S. Navy's battleships met Japan's in a night action at Surigao Strait. Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, his formation spread in a deadly arc, gave a simple order: cross the T. And then the guns spoke, salvo after salvo, a thunder of revenge echoing from ships that had once lain crippled in Pearl Harbor. The West Virginia, the California, and the Tennessee, all wounded in 1941, now led the bombardment. Their shells smashed through Japanese hulls, their searchlights cutting through the smoke like ghosts returned from the dead. The battle ended in annihilation. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once the terror of the Pacific, was shattered beyond repair. Its carriers were decoys, its battleships sunk, its air wings destroyed. From that point forward, Japan would never again challenge America at sea. But the cost of victory was high. The further the U.S. pushed toward Japan, the bloodier the fighting became. At Iwo Jima, 20,000 Japanese soldiers waited underground for death rather than surrender. The Marines fought inch by inch, flame and grenade clearing tunnels filled with the enemy. When the flag rose over Mount Suribachi, the image traveled around the world, a symbol not just of victory, but of endurance. Then came Okinawa, the final and fiercest battle of the Pacific, an inferno of rain, mud, and death. Japanese kamikazes hurled themselves at American ships, turning the sky into a storm of fire. More than 12,000 Americans were killed, over 100,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians perished. It was a preview of what an invasion of Japan itself would cost, and a warning the world would heed in the months ahead. Through it all, the shadow of Pearl Harbor hung over the fleet, not as fear, but as fuel. Every sailor knew why they fought. Every battle, every mile reclaimed was a step closer to justice. The same ships that had once burned in the harbor now lit the night with gunfire over Tokyo Bay. When the U.S. Navy steamed toward Japan in 1945, its decks were lined with men who had been young recruits on that December morning. Now older, harder, and battle-tested, they watched as the rising sun dimmed behind clouds of smoke. The empire that had sought to strike a fatal blow had instead awakened its own destruction. By the time the fleet anchored at Tokyo Bay, the world had turned completely. The Pacific, once a place of loss, had become the path of redemption. The ships that had once burned now carried peace terms. The ghosts of Pearl Harbor sailed home, not in silence, but in victory. The war that had begun in surprise ended in reversal. The tide that had once run crimson through Hawaii now returned, steady and sure, carrying with it the weight of vengeance fulfilled and the dawn of a new world. By the summer of 1945, the empire that had once ruled the Pacific stood on the edge of extinction. The rising sun, the emblem of Japan's divine ambition, was sinking beneath clouds of smoke and fire. After years of relentless combat, Japan was surrounded. Its navy lay at the bottom of the sea, its air force reduced to desperate kamikazes, its army starving and cut off on distant islands. The once proud cities of the empire, Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama, now burned night after night under the thunder of American bombers. The US B-29 superfortresses flew from the captured islands of Saipan and Tinian, crossing thousands of miles to rain fire upon the homeland. In March 1945, Tokyo endured the deadliest air raid in history, more lethal than either atomic bomb that would follow. Napalm fell in liquid rivers across wooden neighborhoods, the flames consumed everything in their path. Over 100,000 civilians died in a single night, the city reduced to a smoldering plain of ash and wind. Still, Japan fought on. The government refused to surrender. Its leaders clung to the illusion that one final, decisive battle could change the tide. They trained schoolchildren with bamboo spears. They armed civilians. They prepared to die as a nation rather than yield. Across the Pacific, the United States prepared for Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan itself. Military planners estimated that it would cost over 1 million Allied casualties and perhaps 10 million Japanese deaths. The thought alone chilled every commander who read the figures. But then came a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen, a force born not of fire, but of the atom. On August 6, 1945, a single B-29 bomber, Enola Gay, flew above the city of Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., it released its payload, a bomb nicknamed Little Boy. In an instant, the world changed forever. The flash was brighter than the sun. A city of 300,000 people vanished into silence. Hiroshima became a wound in the earth, shadows of the dead burned into walls, rivers filled with the living and dying side by side. 3 days later, on August 9, another bomber, Boxcar, carried a second weapon, Fat Man, to Nagasaki. Once again, light and death merged in a single instant. Tens of thousands perished, the survivors stumbling through ruins that no longer resembled a city, but a memory of one. The devastation was beyond comprehension. Even Japan's hardened military could not deny the truth, the empire was finished. On August 15, 1945, in a small, dimly lit room inside the Imperial Palace, Emperor Hirohito recorded his first ever radio address to the Japanese people. His voice, calm, sorrowful, and formal, was carried across a broken nation. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. We must endure the unendurable and bear the unbearable. For the first time in history, the voice of a living God spoke in defeat. In that moment, millions knelt before their radios in stunned silence. Some wept. Some refused to believe. Others felt only relief that the dying, at last, might stop. Aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, on September 2, 1945, representatives of Japan signed the formal surrender documents. The same American flag that had flown over Washington, D.C., on December 7, 1941, was brought to the ceremony, faded, creased, and symbolic. General Douglas MacArthur, overseeing the surrender, spoke softly. "It is my earnest hope that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge, out of the blood and carnage of the past." As the pen scratched the paper, the guns of the Missouri thundered in salute, not in anger, but in ending. The war that had begun in surprise and treachery ended in exhaustion and awe. From Pearl Harbor to Hiroshima, the Pacific had devoured millions of lives. Nations had been remade, faith shattered, humanity tested. And yet, out of the destruction, a fragile peace began to take root. The empire that had struck first now bowed its head in silence. The rising sun, once blazing over conquered lands, dimmed to a pale light behind clouds of smoke. And across the sea, in Pearl Harbor, the waters lay still, a mirror reflecting both the beginning and the end of an age. The circle was complete. The war born in infamy had finally fallen quiet. When the guns fell silent and the Pacific finally calmed, Pearl Harbor remained, not just as a place of tragedy, but as a wound upon the ocean. For years, the water still shimmered with the ghostly sheen of oil, the so-called black tears that rose each day from the wreck of the USS Arizona. Beneath that surface lay more than steel. It was a tomb, a sacred resting place for over 1,000 men who had never left their posts. In the years that followed the war, Pearl Harbor was reborn. The U.S. Navy returned to the island, rebuilding the once shattered base into a vital cornerstone of peace and security in the Pacific. Where once fire and chaos had reigned, now ships glided through tranquil waters, their decks carrying new generations of sailors who saluted not in defiance, but in remembrance. The wrecks of the battleships became silent monuments. Divers and engineers worked to raise some, like the USS West Virginia and California, restoring them to service. Others, like the Arizona and Utah, were left where they fell, war graves preserved by choice and reverence. Over time, the harbor itself transformed from a symbol of vulnerability into one of endurance. In the late 1950s, a movement began among veterans and civilians alike, to create a memorial that would honor not just those who perished on December 7, 1941, but the very spirit of sacrifice that defined them. Architects, survivors, and families of the fallen gathered to envision a place where history and humanity would meet. In 1962, the dream took form, the USS Arizona Memorial. Suspended elegantly above the sunken battleship, the white structure seems to float between sea and sky, a bridge between the past and the living world. Its design is deliberate. The center of the memorial sags downward, symbolizing defeat, but the ends rise again, representing ultimate victory and hope. Visitors stand on the platform and gaze down through the clear waters, where the outline of the Arizona rests in eternal shadow. Tiny bubbles of oil still rise, one by one, each drop a heartbeat from the past, a reminder that the ship still breathes beneath the waves. On the marble wall, engraved in solemn precision, are the names of all who were lost that morning. Every year on December 7th, as dawn breaks over Oahu, survivors, sailors, and families gather at the harbor. Wreaths drift across the surface. Trumpets sound the slow, aching notes of taps. And as the sun rises over the calm Pacific, it touches the white memorial with gold, a reflection of both grief and grace. For those who visit, Pearl Harbor is no longer a place of anger or vengeance. It is a sanctuary, a reminder of how peace is born not in triumph, but in memory. The harbor's ships and submarines now carry a different mission, to guard the peace that was once so violently shattered. In the quiet of the morning, as trade winds stir the flags and the waves lap softly at the shore, the words echo once more. Remember Pearl Harbor. But now, those words no longer call for war, they call for understanding, unity, and gratitude. Pearl Harbor was once the spark that set the world ablaze. Now it stands reborn, not as a battlefield, but as a bridge of remembrance, where the living walk above the resting, and the past whispers through the stillness of the sea. Time moved on, but for those who lived through that Sunday morning in December, Pearl Harbor never truly ended. The world changed, the war was won, and decades passed, yet the memories of that day clung to the hearts of survivors like the scent of smoke that never washed away. In the years that followed, the sailors, soldiers, nurses, and civilians who had witnessed the attack began to speak, not as warriors, but as witnesses to history. Their voices, fragile but resolute, carried the sound of the past into the present. Each testimony was more than recollection, it was remembrance made eternal. Some began to write letters and diaries, once tucked away in trunks or attics, rediscovered by families long after the ink had faded. "We were young," one survivor wrote, "and we grew old that day." For many, that morning was the dividing line of their lives. Everything before it belonged to another world. They spoke of the explosions that shattered the calm, of the heat of burning steel, of the screams rising through the smoke. They remembered the smell of oil and seawater, the cries for help from the harbor, and the eerie silence when it was all over. They recalled the comrades who never resurfaced, men whose laughter still echoed in their memories, whose faces they could never forget. As the survivors aged, the urgency to record their experiences grew. Historians, filmmakers, and journalists traveled across the country, sitting beside veterans whose eyes still glistened with the light of that distant fire. Some spoke for the first time in 50 years. Others could speak only briefly before emotion silenced them. One sailor described pulling men from the water as flames drifted across the surface. A nurse remembered performing surgeries for hours without pause, her hands trembling but steady. Another man, just 18 in 1941, said softly, "The hardest part was knowing the war had begun, and we weren't ready." None of us ever forgot that. In these voices, Pearl Harbor lived on, not as a date in a textbook, but as something human, immediate, and eternal. Through oral histories, museum exhibits, and recordings, their stories were preserved, not polished or grand, but raw and real. Each word a bridge across time, carrying emotion that statistics could never hold. For families of the fallen, these memories became sacred inheritances. Children and grandchildren listened to their fathers and grandfathers tell the story of survival and loss. In classrooms, documentaries, and museums, young people who had never seen war came to understand its cost through the trembling words of those who had. When the last survivors gather each year at Pearl Harbor, they stand not only for themselves, but for those who remain beneath the sea. Their voices, cracked with age, steady with purpose, break the morning stillness as they recite the names of their fallen friends. And though one by one those voices are fading, their echoes remain, in the air, in the water, in the very stillness of the harbor that holds their memory. History may soften, time may pass, but memory endures. The men and women of Pearl Harbor are no longer simply witnesses, they are the storytellers of courage, the keepers of a lesson the world must never forget. Their words rise like waves upon the water, whispering across generations. We were young, and we grew old that day. The Pacific is quiet now. Sunlight dances on the calm blue waters of Pearl Harbor, and the palm trees sway gently in the wind, as if the island itself breathes in peace. Yet beneath that peace, the past still moves. From the wreck of the USS Arizona, thin streams of oil drift upward through the water, the black tears of those who never came home. More than 80 years have passed since that Sunday morning, December 7, 1941, the day President Roosevelt called a date which will live in infamy. The world that followed was forged in the fire of that day, a war that consumed continents, ended empires, and gave birth to a new age. But in the stillness of Pearl Harbor, time feels suspended. The harbor remains both a grave and a mirror, reflecting not only tragedy, but transformation. From the ashes of destruction rose something greater than vengeance, resolve. A nation once divided by isolation found unity in purpose. Men and women from farms, factories, and cities stood shoulder to shoulder, turning grief into strength. Ships were rebuilt, armies were raised, and across the Pacific and Atlantic, the cry resounded. Remember Pearl Harbor. Those words began as a battle cry, a call to arms. But as the years passed, they evolved, no longer a summons to fight, but a promise to remember. To remember the sailors who slept beneath the waves, the nurses who tended the wounded, the civilians who faced fire and chaos, and the generation that carried freedom on its back. Each December 7th, the sun rises over the USS Arizona Memorial, and the light spills through its white arches, illuminating the names carved in marble. The survivors who still return each year stand in silence, their reflections trembling on the water. They salute their shipmates who remain below, whispering the same quiet vow, "You are not forgotten." For America, Pearl Harbor became more than a tragedy, it became a compass. It taught a sleeping giant the cost of complacency and the strength of unity. It reminded the world that courage can emerge from chaos, that resilience is born in the darkest hours. The harbor today is both sanctuary and sermon, a place where history speaks softly through ripples and light. Visitors from around the world gaze into the depths, seeing not just the wreckage of war, but the rebirth of a nation that rose from it. And still, the oil rises. Drop by drop, like liquid memory. Each one a silent message from the past, a vow that those who fell in 1941 will forever stand watch beneath these waters. Pearl Harbor is no longer only the beginning of a war. It is the beginning of an understanding, that vigilance must never sleep, that peace is earned, and that remembrance is the truest form of victory. The day of infamy has become the day that defined a century. Its echoes reach through time, in the hum of aircraft, in the rhythm of ship engines, in the still heartbeat of the Pacific. And as long as the Arizona weeps her black tears, the world will remember the men who stood their ground. And the nation that, from that sorrow, awakened forever.